I'm human too. Why are you so cruel to me? Annie Carter spoke with a trembling voice, tears already welling in her eyes. Charles Whitmore looked at her with undisguised contempt. What are you talking about, Annie? He asked. His voice was calm to the point of coldness, almost completely emotionless. Who mistreated you? What exactly did I do? Annie could barely keep the letter in her hands. The disciplinary notice trembled between her fingers. The cold black lines of text blurred behind her tears. Her exam results had been canceled. Her scholarship nomination had been suspended. Her chance at college, the one she had fought for year after year, had been taken from her in a single afternoon. You know, Annie whispered. Charles smirked, his eyes turning cold. No, I don't. And I suggest you choose your next words carefully. Blake Whitmore stood behind his father, his arms crossed over his chest, his face filled with satisfaction. Principal Margaret Hale remained near the conference room door, clutching a file folder tightly against her chest. Mrs. Larkin, the exam supervisor, stood beside her with her lips pressed into a thin line, as if Annie's pain had become an inconvenience that had gone on far too long. Miss Carter, Mrs. Larkin said, there is no need for you to explain any further. The matter is very clear. That device was found in your pocket during the exam. It wasn't mine, Annie said, choking on the words. I didn't put it there. I didn't even know it was in my pocket. Mrs. Larkin shook her head. That is also what you told the board. Because it's the truth. Principal Hale looked down at the file instead of meeting Annie's eyes. Annie, the school board has reviewed the situation. At this point, continuing to deny it will not help you. Annie turned to her, desperate enough that her voice nearly broke. Please, Principal Hale. You know me. You've seen my grades. Ask Mr. Brooks. Check my old tests. Check the cameras. The hallway camera had a technical malfunction. Only today? Annie asked. Charles stepped closer. He did not need to raise his voice. It was his calmness that sent a chill down Annie's spine. Annie, he said, you need to accept reality. The result is what it is. The decision has already been made. Annie stared at him. Accept it. He said it as if her life were nothing more than a bad weather report people had to hear and then move on from. I can't accept a lie, she said. Charles narrowed his eyes. You are in no position to use the word lie here. Blake let out a quiet laugh. Maybe she should have thought about college before bringing a cheating device into the exam room. Annie flinched as if the words had struck her. I didn't cheat, she said, looking at Blake before turning back to the adults in the room. I studied for that exam. I earned that score myself. I worked for everything I had. Mrs. Larkin's voice remained flat and emotionless. That device was in your pocket. That pen wasn't mine. At last, Principal Hale looked at her, but there was no protection in her eyes and no courage, only avoidance. The school office has been notified that your recommendation letter is under review. Until the official process is complete, we cannot continue supporting your scholarship application. Annie felt as if someone had closed a hand around her throat. Charles stood there, watching her fall apart, and his face did not move. You should go home, he said. Learn to accept the consequences. Not everyone gets the future they want. Annie lifted her face. Tears ran down her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. She was too tired, too hurt, and too afraid. You wanted this to happen, she said. Principal Hale stiffened immediately. Annie. Mrs. Larkin took a step forward. That is inappropriate. But Annie kept her eyes on Charles. Her voice was small and broken, but every word was clear. You wanted Blake to win. You wanted me out of the race. Blake pushed himself away from the wall. Don't drag my father into this. I saw the pen, Annie said, her breathing heavy. Earlier. In his pocket. It looked exactly like the pen everyone said was mine. Same black pen. Same scratch near the clip. Charles took a small step back before he could stop himself. Then he adjusted his jacket. That is a disgusting accusation. Annie stared at him, stunned by how quickly he had turned her pain into an insult against himself. I'm telling the truth. No, Charles said sharply. You are desperate. You were caught with a cheating device, and now you think you can save yourself by accusing me. A donor, a board member, a parent who has contributed more to this school than your family could ever imagine. Annie lowered her head. Her shoulders began to shake. My family never did anything to hurt you, she said. Charles leaned forward slightly. His voice was so cold that Principal Hale had to look away. Then perhaps your family should have taught you that actions have consequences. A small sound escaped Annie's throat. Half sob, half trapped breath. Blake smiled again. That's right, consequences. Annie looked from Blake to Charles, then to Principal Hale. Her eyes were pleading before the words even came out. Please, if this goes on my record, no college will accept me. You know that. Everyone here knows that. Principal Hale swallowed. The process will determine what happens next. What process? Annie asked. The camera is broken. My work is being dismissed. That device wasn't mine, and no one is willing to listen. Mrs. Larkin replied coldly. The board has heard enough. Annie clutched the notice against her chest as if the paper itself could help her stay standing. Then she looked at Charles again. What did I ever do to you? She asked. I went to class. I studied hard. I stayed quiet when Blake mocked me. I worked harder because I knew I couldn't afford to make mistakes. That is all I ever did. Charles said nothing. Annie's knees trembled. Grace Miller, standing a few steps away, reached out toward her, but Annie did not move. Farther down the hallway, Mr. Brooks stood frozen, his face tight with helpless anger. Charles turned slightly toward Principal Hale. This conversation is over. No, Annie sobbed, her voice catching. It's over for you because you get to walk away. But I don't. You get to go home. And I have to live with what you did. Blake snapped. Don't talk to him like that. Annie barely heard him anymore. Her eyes remained fixed on Charles. All you had to do was sign a paper, make one phone call, and you could stop my entire life, she said through her tears. You could decide that I didn't deserve college just because your son wanted to win an award. You could destroy me and still call yourself a good man. Charles's jaw tightened, but he did not deny it. That silence gave Annie the answer she had always been afraid of. Her voice grew smaller, softer, so wounded it almost sounded like a child's. Why? She asked. Why would you do that to me? I'm a person too. How could you be so cruel to me? For a few seconds, no one said anything. Then Charles glanced at her with eyes so cold it was as if she had already been erased from the room. Principal Hale, he said, make sure Miss Carter is escorted out before this situation gets any worse. Annie closed her eyes. Then Annie opened her eyes. Come on, Grace said gently. Let me get you out of here. Annie did not answer. She only stared at the conference room door, at the place where Charles Whitmore had been standing before he turned and walked away, calm as if he had just signed a receipt. Principal Hale had followed him inside. Mrs. Larkin had left as well. Blake lingered for a few more seconds, just long enough to throw Annie one last satisfied look. Mr. Brooks walked toward her with slow, steady steps. Annie, he called softly. So this was it. Annie tried to take a deep breath, but it came out broken. They're not going to listen to me. I know. They've already made up their minds. I know. Then that means it's over. Mr. Brooks shook his head. No. It means they want you to believe it's over. Grace looked toward the conference room, anger clear on her face. They can't just do that. They can't cancel your score and then pretend the camera just happened to be broken today. They can, Mr. Brooks said, if no one stops them. Annie wiped her face with her sleeve and looked down at the letter again. The words on the paper looked even colder than before. Preliminary decision. Formal review. Violation of academic integrity. Nomination suspended. They sounded so official they could bury a person alive. What am I supposed to tell my aunt? Annie asked. She thinks I'm at a scholarship review meeting. Mr. Brooks's expression softened. He understood that kind of question. It was not just fear. It was the pain of a child who had to bring terrible news home to someone who had sacrificed everything for her. Tell her the truth, he said, and let her stand with you. Annie's lips trembled. She worked a double shift last night. Then she understands injustice better than anyone. Grace gently squeezed Annie's arm. I'll take you home. Out of habit, Annie almost refused. She was used to taking the bus. Used to handling things on her own. Used to not bothering anyone. Used to accepting only the kind of help that did not cost people too much. But her legs were still shaking, and the thought of sitting alone on a bus with that letter in her hand made her chest tighten again. Okay, she whispered. They walked together toward the main entrance without saying much. The school day had not ended yet, but the news had already spread. Annie could feel it in the way conversations faded when she passed by. Eyes glanced at her and quickly turned away. Whispers were swallowed halfway through. That was what Annie hated most. Not the laughter, but the silence pretending not to know. Annie stopped in front of the trophy case. Grace took one more step before she noticed and turned back. Annie, behind the glass were polished certificates and framed photographs from years past. Debate champions, science fair winners, community leadership awards. Near the center was a photo from last semester. Annie stood beside Mr. Brooks, holding a certificate from the state civic essay competition. She remembered that day clearly. Aunt Clara had worn her church dress and clapped louder than anyone else. Blake had sat 2 rows away, staring down at his phone. Charles had been there too, smiling at donors and talking about excellence as if it were something his family owned. Now Annie stared at her own face in the picture. That girl looked hopeful, not exactly innocent, but close enough, and it made her heart ache. Grace followed her gaze. They have no right to take that from you. They already did. No, Grace said, her voice firmer now. They're trying to. Mr. Brooks stood a few steps away, his hands in the pockets of his jacket. Miss Carter, listen to me. Lies spread quickly in places like this because people are afraid to slow them down. But every lie has a crack in it. We're going to find that crack. Annie wanted to believe him. She truly did. But belief required strength. And most of her strength had already been used, just to remain standing. Outside, the afternoon sunlight felt painfully bright. Grace's car was parked near the student lot, an old blue Honda her mother had left her. On the other side of the parking area, Blake's red sports car sat near the entrance, spotless and arrogant even when it was still. Annie looked at it and remembered Blake's voice in the hallway. I guess the Whitmore Award goes to someone who knows how to follow the rules. She felt sick. Grace unlocked the car. Get in. Annie slid into the passenger seat and held her backpack tightly on her lap. Mr. Brooks leaned down beside the window before Grace could start the car. I'm going to request copies of every document from that hearing, he said. Your exam records, the proctor's report, the incident report, everything. Will they give them to you? Grace asked. At first, they'll avoid it. Then they'll delay. Then they'll act annoyed, because I keep asking. Grace frowned. That sounds like they won't give them to you. That sounds like Whitmore Prep, he replied. Then he looked at Annie. But I know how you work. I know how you write, how you solve problems, how you build an argument. If they switched anything, there will be signs. Annie looked up. Switched something? Mr. Brooks looked directly into her eyes. I don't say that lightly. Annie's fingers tightened around the edge of her backpack. Grace said at once, We'll help. Mr. Brooks nodded. Tonight, write down everything you remember, minute by minute. Who stood where, who touched your bag, who left the room. Small details matter, especially when powerful people are counting on everyone else being too scared to remember. Annie swallowed. I don't know if I can do that. You can do it even while you're crying, he said gently, but do it. Grace drove out of the school parking lot. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. Atlanta traffic moved slowly around them. Parents in SUVs. Office workers returning from lunch. Delivery trucks blocking lanes. Finally, Grace said, My mom knows a lawyer. No, Annie answered immediately. Annie, no. Lawyers cost money, and if this gets bigger, they'll say I'm attacking the school. They're already attacking you. Annie closed her eyes. You don't understand. If they put this on my record, I'm finished. If colleges think I'm a troublemaker, I'm finished too. If I go against Charles Whitmore and lose, I'm more than finished. Grace was silent for a while. You're right. I don't understand all of it, but I know wrong when I see it. Annie turned her face toward the window. Knowing something is wrong doesn't mean you can beat it. Grace had no answer. When they reached the apartment, Aunt Clara opened the door before Annie could knock a second time. She was still wearing her blue nursing scrubs, but her shoes were off, and worry was already written across her tired face. What happened? She asked. Annie tried to speak, but no sound came out. Aunt Clara looked from Annie's swollen red eyes to Grace standing behind her, then down at the folded letter clutched in Annie's hand. Her face changed. Oh, sweetheart. That was all it took. Annie stepped into the apartment and broke down sobbing. The letter slipped from her hand and fell near the doormat. Grace bent down, picked it up, and silently handed it to Aunt Clara. Aunt Clara stood in the doorway and read the letter. Her eyes moved slowly over each line. and Annie felt as if every word were cutting into her aunt's body. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully. "They're saying you cheated?" "I didn't," Annie cried into her aunt's shoulder. "Aunt Clara, I swear I didn't." "I know you didn't. They found a device in my pocket." "I said I know." The certainty in her aunt's voice made Annie cry even harder. All afternoon, she had been begging to be believed, and now belief had come before any explanation. Grace stood awkwardly near the door. "Mrs. Carter, if you want, I can stay. Or I can go." Aunt Clara looked at her. "You're Grace?" "Yes, ma'am." "Do you believe my niece?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then you can sit down." Grace sat down. Aunt Clara led Annie to the kitchen table and placed a glass of water in front of her. It was the same table where, that morning, there had been oatmeal, toast, and the soft light of hope. Now a disciplinary notice lay on it, as if it had polluted the whole room. "What exactly did they say?" Aunt Clara asked. Annie told her everything. When she reached the part where she had accused Charles and he had called her desperate, Aunt Clara closed her eyes. "That man," she said quietly, "looked at you and saw a child he thought no one would protect." Annie stared down at the table. Maybe he was right. Aunt Clara immediately leaned forward. "Don't ever say that in this house. But what if I can't prove it? Then we'll find someone who can help. What if no one listens? Then we'll speak louder." Annie looked at her aunt, exhausted down to her bones. "I'm so tired." "I know. I'm tired of having to prove I'm not the person they think I am." If this scene touched your heart, please like this video, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about courage, justice, and hope. Aunt Clara reached across the table and placed her hand over Annie's. Her hand was rough from work, warm from dishwater, and from years of carrying everything alone. "Your mother used to say the same thing," she said. Annie looked up. "She did?" Aunt Clara nodded. Different room, same fight. Grace's phone buzzed. She checked the screen, and her face immediately tightened. "What is it?" Annie asked. Grace hesitated. "Grace, what is it?" Grace turned the screen toward Annie. Someone had just posted a message in the student group chat. "Heard the scholarship girl got caught cheating on the final. Guess she's not as smart as she looks." Annie stared at the message until the words blurred. Aunt Clara gently took the phone from Grace's hand, glanced at it once, and placed it face down on the table. "No," she said. Annie wiped her tears. "No what?" "No, they do not get to write the story about you and then force you to live inside it." Aunt Clara pushed the glass of water closer to Annie. "Drink. Then you're going to write down everything you remember." Mr. Brooks said the same thing. "Good," Aunt Clara said. "That is a wise man." Annie held the glass with both hands. Her hands were still trembling, but not as violently as before. Annie wrote until the lines on the page began to lean into one another. At first, the memories came out broken. 8:05. Arrived at school. 8:17. Saw Blake near lockers. 8:41. Entered testing room. Mrs. Larkin. By the door. Bag placed on back table. Grace 2 seats left. Blake near the window. She stopped, crossed out a word, tried again. The pen was not in my hand. I only used my blue pencil and calculator. Mrs. Larkin left the room once, maybe twice. Evan Cole came to the door. He spoke to her. I didn't hear what he said. Aunt Clara sat across from her, reading every line as if it were scripture. Grace stayed longer than she planned. Her phone on the table, copying Annie's notes into a clean timeline. Every now and then, she asked a question gently, careful not to make it sound like an interrogation. "Was your backpack zipped when you put it on the table?" Annie closed her eyes, trying to see the room again. "Yes, I always zip it. Did anyone stand near the bags?" Mrs. Larkin. Then Evan, when he came in. I think he stood near the back table. "Did Blake?" Annie shook her head, then paused. "Not during the exam. But before we started, he walked past my desk and said, 'Good luck. You'll need it.' I thought he was just being Blake." Grace typed that in. Aunt Clara's mouth tightened. People tell on themselves more than they know. Annie looked at the clock above the stove. It was almost 8. The room smelled of reheated chicken soup and coffee gone cold. She had not touched the soup. Aunt Clara had stopped telling her to eat after the 3rd try and simply left the bowl nearby. as if food could wait until grief made room for it. Grace's phone buzzed again. She checked it, frowned, and turned the screen down. Annie noticed. More messages? Nothing useful. That means yes. Grace hesitated. People are talking. But people talk because they don't know anything. They know what the school wants them to know. Aunt Clara reached for Annie's notebook and tapped the page. Then we give them something else to know. Annie wanted to believe that sentence could carry them. But beyond that kitchen, beyond the yellow light over the table and the tired love in her aunt's eyes, Charles Whitmore had money, lawyers, a last name on the science hall, and a son who was probably laughing somewhere Annie would never be invited. Across town, Blake Whitmore was not laughing as much as Annie imagined. He was sitting at the long dining table in his father's house in Buckhead, pushing asparagus around his plate while Charles cut into his steak with the slow precision he used for everything. The house was too quiet. It had high ceilings, expensive art, and rooms that made sound disappear. Blake used to think that meant they were rich. Now he knew it also meant no one in that house had to listen to anyone else if they did not want to. Charles had not said much since they left the school. That worried Blake more than anger would have. Finally, Blake dropped his fork. She's going to keep talking. Charles did not look up. Let her. She accused you in the hallway. She accused me while crying in front of half a dozen people after being caught with a device. That does not make her credible. Blake leaned back. Mr. Brooks was there. Charles's knife paused. Blake saw it and sat a little straighter. He heard everything. Daniel Brooks has made a habit of inserting himself where he does not belong. He likes her. He can like her from retirement if he becomes a problem. Blake stared at his father. Can you do that? Charles looked up then. Do you want me to? Blake did not answer right away. He wanted Annie gone. He wanted the award. He wanted to stop walking into classrooms where teachers compared his empty work with her clean, sharp answers. He wanted his father to look at him once without measuring what was missing. But hearing Charles speak that way about Mr. Brooks, a man who had never been afraid to call Blake lazy to his face, made something small and uneasy move in his stomach. Charles noticed. Blake, listen to me. There are moments in life when people either protect what belongs to them or spend the rest of their lives apologizing to those who take it. She didn't take anything from me. Charles's eyes hardened. Blake regretted saying it. She humiliated you, Charles said. Repeatedly. Publicly. She stood on stages that should have been yours while people whispered that my son could not compete with a scholarship student. Blake looked down at his plate. Maybe I couldn't. The words came out before he could stop them. The dining room went still. Charles set down his utensils. That is exactly the kind of weakness she has taught you to accept. Blake's face burned. She didn't teach me anything. No, that is the problem. You have had every advantage, and still you let a girl with a bus pass and a second-hand backpack make you look small. Blake's jaw tightened. So you fixed it. Charles took a sip of wine. I corrected an imbalance. That's one way to say it. Charles leaned back, studying his son. Do you feel guilty? Blake laughed once, but it sounded thin. No. Good. Guilt is useful only when it keeps decent people decent. In people like us, it becomes a weapon others use to make us surrender what we've built. Blake did not know what to say to that. His father spoke like every cruel thing had a philosophy behind it. Maybe that was how rich men slept at night. They named their sins something cleaner. Charles folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate. You will receive the Whitmore Award. You will stand straight. You will thank the school, your teachers, and your family. You will not mention Annie Carter. What if she appeals? She will. What if they find something? Charles smiled faintly, not with humor. There is nothing to find unless someone goes looking where they should not. At that same moment, Mr. Brooks was doing exactly that. He sat alone in his classroom with the lights dimmed except for the lamp on his desk. The halls had emptied hours ago. The cleaning staff moved somewhere in the building. Trash bags rustling, wheels squeaking. He had a stack of Annie's old essays and exams spread before him, along with a copy of the incident summary he had managed to obtain from a sympathetic office assistant who had whispered, "I can't be involved." While sliding it across the counter, he read the report twice. Then a third time. The language was neat, official, and bloodless. Unauthorized device located in student's personal belongings. Student denied knowledge of device. Testing integrity compromised. Recommendation: cancellation of score, pending review. No mention that Annie had never had a discipline issue. No mention that her previous work made cheating unnecessary. No mention that the camera failed at the exact hallway outside the testing room. No mention that Evan Cole had no reason to be at that door during an exam. Mr. Brooks removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Lord," he said quietly, "give me patience, because I'm fresh out of politeness." A knock came at the door. He looked up. Grace stood there, backpack over one shoulder. Annie was beside her, pale and tired, clutching the Navy notebook. Mr. Brooks frowned. "You should be home." Annie lifted the notebook. "I wrote it down," Grace added. "We didn't want to wait." He could have scolded them. It was late. Annie had been through enough. Grace had already done more than most friends would. But then he saw Annie's face. Not strong, not fearless, just afraid, and still standing there anyway. He opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. Annie stepped into the classroom and set the notebook on his desk. Her hands trembled as she opened to the timeline. Mr. Brooks read in silence. Grace watched him. Annie watched the floor. When he reached the part about Evan Cole standing near the bags, his eyes stopped. "What?" Grace asked. Mr. Brooks did not answer immediately. He reached for the incident report and placed it beside Annie's notes. "In the official report," he said, "Mrs. Larkin states that no non-testing personnel entered the room after students arrived." Annie looked up. "But Evan came to the door." "You're sure?" "Yes. He had a gray campus tech badge." He spoke to her. She stepped out for a minute. Grace leaned over the desk. "So Mrs. Larkin lied." Mr. Brooks's face was grim. "Or she left out the part that matters." Annie's throat tightened. "Can that help?" "It can start." He pulled a legal pad from his drawer and began writing. "Tomorrow, I request the visitor log, the hallway maintenance report, and the backup server record." Grace blinked. "There's a backup server?" "Schools like this back up everything except their courage." Annie almost smiled, but it faded quickly. "What if they refuse?" Mr. Brooks looked at her. "They will." "Then what?" "Then we ask why they're so afraid of proving you guilty." For the first time that night, Annie felt the lie around her shift. Not break, not yet, but shift. Mr. Brooks closed the report and placed his hand over it. "They wanted this to end in that hallway," he said. "So we begin there." By morning, Annie's name had already become a story other people were telling without her. She felt it before she heard it. The way conversations thinned when she stepped through the front doors. The way students glanced at her and then pretended to check their phones. The way two boys near the office stopped laughing too suddenly. Whitmore Prep had always been a place where rumors traveled fast, but this one moved like it had been given permission. Grace walked beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Don't look at them," Grace said. "I can feel them looking. Then let them get a good view of you walking in." Annie tried to smile, but it did not reach her face. Her stomach had been tight since breakfast. Aunt Clara had packed toast and a boiled egg in a paper bag, but Annie had only managed 2 bites before the bus came. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Charles Whitmore's face when he told her to accept the result. At the main office, Mr. Brooks was already waiting. He wore the same brown jacket he wore on cold mornings, and he held a yellow legal pad under one arm. "You ready?" he asked. Annie shook her head. "Good," he said. "Ready is overrated. Present is enough." They walked into Principal Hale's office together. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. Framed photographs lined the shelves. Graduating classes, ribbon cuttings, Charles Whitmore shaking hands in front of the science hall. Annie's eyes caught on that photo, and she looked away. Principal Hale sat behind her desk. Her posture was straight, but her face looked worn. She glanced at Grace, then at Mr. Brooks. "This is not a hearing," she said. "No one said it was," Mr. Brooks replied. "We're requesting records." Principal Hale folded her hands. "Daniel, this matter is under review. There are procedures. Then the records should support the procedure. We cannot release everything to students. I'm not asking for everything. I'm asking for the visitor log outside the testing wing, the maintenance report on the hallway camera, and confirmation of whether backup video exists." Principal Hale's eyes moved briefly to Annie. "That information may not be available." Grace spoke before she could stop herself. "How do you know if you haven't checked?" Principal Hale's mouth tightened. "Miss Miller, I understand you want to support your friend, but this is a serious matter. That's why we're here. Annie stood quietly, hands clasped in front of her. She wanted to speak, but the room made her feel small again. Principal Hale did not sound cruel. That made it worse. Cruel people were easier to hate. People who were kind in tone while letting harm continue were harder to understand. Mr. Brooks placed Annie's timeline on the desk. Miss Carter remembers Evan Cole entering the testing room after students had arrived. Mrs. Larkin's report says no non-testing personnel entered. Those two things cannot both be true. Principal Hale did not touch the paper. Memory can be unreliable under stress. Annie looked up then. I wasn't stressed when he came in. I was taking an exam. The room went quiet. Principal Hale finally picked up the timeline, skimmed it, and set it down. I'll ask about the log. And the camera report, Mr. Brooks said. I said I'll ask. No, Margaret. With respect, you'll request it in writing. And you'll copy me on that request. Her eyes sharpened. You are forgetting your position. Mr. Brooks leaned back, calm but firm. No, I'm remembering it. I teach here. I don't work for Charles Whitmore. The name hung in the room. Principal Hale stood. This meeting is over. Annie's chest tightened. Please, she said. Principal Hale paused. Annie hated how weak her voice sounded, but she could not make it stronger. If I did what they say, then the records will prove it. If I didn't, they'll prove that too. I'm not asking you to believe me because you like me. I'm asking you to check. For the first time, Principal Hale's expression cracked. Not much. Just enough for Annie to see the woman inside the title. I will make the request, she said quietly. Mr. Brooks nodded once. Thank you. They left before she could take it back. In the hallway, Grace let out the breath she had been holding. That was something, right? It was a door, Mr. Brooks said. Not an open one, but not locked. Annie wanted to feel relieved. Instead, she felt watched. Down the hall, Blake stood near the trophy case with two boys from the senior class. When he saw them, he pushed away from the wall. Well, he said, the defense team. Grace muttered, keep walking. But Blake stepped into Annie's path. You really don't know when to stop, he said. Annie kept her eyes down. Move, Blake. Or what? You'll accuse me too? Mr. Brooks's voice came low behind her. Mr. Whitmore, get to class. Blake smiled at him. Careful, sir. Wouldn't want you getting involved in things above your pay grade. Mr. Brooks did not move. My pay grade covers protecting students from bullies. You qualify. One of Blake's friends looked away, trying not to laugh. Blake noticed and his face darkened. This is why people are tired of you, he said to Annie. You get caught, and somehow everybody else is the villain. Annie swallowed. I didn't get caught. I got set up. By my father? Blake stepped closer. Say it again. I want witnesses. Grace moved between them. Back off. Blake ignored her. You think because teachers clap for you, that makes you special? You're not special, Annie. You were useful. A nice little story for the brochures. Poor girl works hard. School looks generous. But now you're bad publicity. The words hit exactly where he meant them to. Mr. Brooks took one step forward. Enough. Blake looked at him, then at Annie. My father fixes problems. You were a problem. That's all. Annie's head lifted. Grace froze. Mr. Brooks's eyes narrowed, but Blake seemed to realize too late how much he had said. He laughed as if it meant nothing, and walked away with his friends. Grace grabbed Annie's sleeve. You heard that. Annie nodded, but her mouth had gone dry. Mr. Brooks was already writing in his pad. What are you doing? Grace asked, recording the exact words before anyone has time to soften them. Annie stared down the hall where Blake had disappeared. He knows. Yes, Mr. Brooks said, and now we know he knows. The rest of the day moved like a test Annie had not studied for. In English, no one sat beside her except Grace. In chemistry, her lab partner asked the teacher if he could switch groups, then pretended it was about focus. At lunch, Annie stayed in the library because she could not bear the cafeteria. Mr. Brooks found her there near the back shelves, untouched sandwich in front of her. You need to eat, he said. Aunt Clara said that too. Smart woman. Annie peeled back the paper around the sandwich but did not take a bite. Did you ever get accused of something you didn't do? Mr. Brooks sat across from her. For a moment, He looked older than he had that morning. My senior year, he said. A teacher said I plagiarized an essay because she didn't believe I could write it. Annie looked at him. What happened? My mother came to school in her work shoes and church hat. She asked that teacher to show her the book I supposedly copied from. Teacher couldn't. Principal told everyone to move on. Did they apologize? He gave a small smile without humor. People who need you small rarely apologize for trying to make you fit. Annie looked down. I'm tired of being a lesson. I know. I don't want to be strong. I just want my score back. That's fair. And my name. That too. And I want them to stop looking at me like I did it. Mr. Brooks leaned forward. Then we keep going. Before Annie could answer, his phone buzzed. He checked the screen and stood. What is it? Principal Hale copied me on the request. Grace, who had just arrived with a bottle of water, leaned over. For the records? Yes. That's good. Mr. Brooks read farther, and his expression changed. Annie noticed. What? The maintenance report says the hallway camera failed at 8:36. Grace frowned. The exam started at 8:30. Annie gripped the sandwich paper. Evan came to the door after that. Mr. Brooks nodded slowly. And the visitor log says Evan Cole entered the testing wing at 8:34 and left at 8:42. Grace's eyes widened, so he was there when the camera failed. And when Mrs. Larkin says no one entered, Annie felt the first real pulse of hope, sharp enough to hurt. Does that prove it? No, Mr. Brooks said, but it proves the official report is incomplete. Grace smiled. Incomplete is a polite word for lying. Mr. Brooks slipped the phone into his pocket. Polite words are useful until it's time to stop being polite. Annie finally took a small bite of the sandwich. It tasted like nothing, but Aunt Clara would ask, and she wanted to be able to say yes. Across campus, in a small technology office behind the media lab, Evan Cole stared at the same maintenance report on his computer screen. Sweat gathered at his hairline, though the room was cool. His phone lay beside the keyboard. It rang once. He flinched. The screen showed a number he had saved under CW. Evan let it ring twice more before answering. Sir? Charles Whitmore's voice was quiet. I understand records were requested. Evan closed his eyes. Yes, sir. And? There's a log. It shows I was in the testing wing. You had a reason to be there. I know, but Mrs. Larkin's report says... I did not call to hear what the report says, Charles interrupted. I called to remind you that people with debts should be careful about creating new ones. Evan swallowed. Mr. Whitmore, I did what you asked. Then continue doing it. Say as little as possible. Let the school handle the girl. After Charles hung up, Evan sat very still. Outside the office, students passed by laughing, carrying books, talking about games and weekend plans. Evan looked at the locked drawer beside his desk where he had hidden the small black device Charles's man had given him after the exam. He had been told to dispose of it. He had not. At the library table, Annie did not know any of that yet. All she had was a time, a name, and a contradiction. But for the first time since the boardroom, the lie had a crack wide enough for light to touch. That evening, Annie sat at the kitchen table with 3 pages of notes, a cold cup of tea, and a feeling she did not know how to name. It was not relief. Relief was too clean. This was more like standing in a dark room and seeing a thin line under the door. Aunt Clara came in from the laundry closet with a basket against her hip. You still on that timeline? Annie nodded. Mr. Brooks said the visitor log proves Evan was there when the camera failed. Aunt Clara set the basket down. And Evan is who? The tech guy? The one who had no reason to be near your exam? Right. Aunt Clara pulled out a chair and sat. She looked tired in the way working people look tired. Not sleepy, just worn down by other people's needs. Baby, listen to me. A man like Charles Whitmore doesn't usually do his own dirty work. He finds someone who needs money, or approval, or forgiveness. That's where you look. Annie tapped her pen against the notebook. Evan looked scared today when I passed the media lab. Scared people either tell the truth or run from it. I don't know how to make him talk. You don't, Aunt Clara said. You let the truth make him uncomfortable. Annie looked at her. You sound like Mr. Brooks. That man has sense. The phone rang before Annie could answer. Aunt Clara picked it up, listened for a few seconds, then looked toward Annie. It's the college office, she said quietly. Annie's stomach dropped. Aunt Clara put it on speaker and set the phone on the table. Miss Carter? A woman asked. This is Miss Donnelly from the Academic Advising Office at Whitmore Prep. Annie forced her voice out. Yes, ma'am. I'm calling to inform you that your scholarship packet remains on hold until the disciplinary review is resolved. We've also received notice from 2 university partners requesting clarification. What does that mean? Aunt Clara asked. It means colleges may pause evaluation until the matter is settled. How long? There was a careful silence. That depends on the board. Aunt Clara's face hardened. The same board that canceled her score before checking the camera? Ma'am, I'm only relaying the status. Annie stared at the college brochure on the refrigerator. The corners had curled from months of being held under the peach magnet. If it takes too long, she said. Could I lose my spot? Miss Donnelly softened, but softness did not change the answer. Deadlines are deadlines, Annie. I'm sorry. After the call ended, the apartment seemed smaller. Aunt Clara reached across the table. Look at me. Annie did not. Look at me, baby. Annie lifted her eyes, and the tears came before she could stop them. They're running out the clock. I know. They don't even have to prove I cheated. They just have to wait until it's too late. Aunt Clara's hand closed over hers. Then we don't wait with them. The next morning, Grace met Annie outside the front gate with 2 coffees and a folder pressed under her arm. Annie had barely stepped off the bus before Grace pushed 1 cup into her hand. Drink. You look like you fought a ceiling fan and lost. Annie blinked. Good morning to you too. Grace lowered her voice. I found something. Annie's fingers tightened around the cup. What? Not here. They went to the side courtyard near the chapel, where seniors sometimes sat during lunch when the weather was warm. At that hour, it was empty except for fallen leaves and a groundskeeper trimming hedges far enough away not to hear. Grace opened the folder. Inside were printed screenshots from student group chats. I went back 3 weeks, she said. Blake's been running his mouth. Annie read the first screenshot. Can't wait till the Whitmore Award stops being charity hour. The second was worse. Dad says optics matter. School needs the right winner this year. Annie swallowed. He wrote that? In a group chat with 6 people. One of them forwarded it to me after I asked around. Why would they help? Grace made a face. Because Blake is mean to everybody eventually. Annie read the final screenshot. Relax. Dad handled the scholarship girl. Her hands went cold. Grace watched her. I know it's not a confession, but it's something. It's him, Annie whispered. I know. Annie looked across campus toward the main building. Students walked under the brick arches with backpacks and breakfast sandwiches, laughing like the world had not shifted beneath her feet. We have to show Mr. Brooks, Grace said. They found him in his classroom before first period. He read the screenshots without speaking. The longer he stayed quiet, the more Annie worried. Is it useful? Grace asked. Mr. Brooks placed the pages on his desk. It's not enough by itself, but together with the visitor log and Mrs. Larkin's false report, it helps build intent. Grace exhaled. Good. Annie did not feel good. What if they say Blake was joking? They will. What if they say I'm twisting it because I'm angry? They will say that too. Grace threw up her hands. Then what's the point? Mr. Brooks looked at both of them. The point is not one piece of proof. The point is weight. One stone gets dismissed. A pile becomes hard to step over. Before Annie could answer, the classroom door opened. Principal Hale stood there. She looked from Mr. Brooks to Grace to Annie, then to the screenshots on the desk. Daniel, she said, may I speak with you outside? Mr. Brooks did not move. If it concerns Annie, she can hear it. Principal Hale stepped in and closed the door behind her. I received a call from Mr. Whitmore this morning. Grace muttered. Of course you did. Principal Hale ignored her. He is concerned that students and staff are spreading unfounded allegations against his family. Annie felt heat rise behind her eyes again. Not tears this time. Exhaustion. Mr. Brooks said, his son's messages are not unfounded. They are private student messages taken out of context. Grace snapped. He said his dad handled her. And you, Principal Hale said, finally looking at her, should be very careful about distributing screenshots that could be considered harassment. Grace stepped back as if she had been slapped. Annie spoke before fear could stop her. So Blake can say things about me, but if Grace shows them, she's harassing him? Principal Hale's face flickered. That is not what I said. It's what it sounds like. The room went still. Mr. Brooks's voice was calm. "Margaret, are you here to help find the truth or to warn us away from it?" She closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, she looked older. "I'm trying to keep this from becoming something none of you can control." "It already is," Annie said softly, "because you let him control it first." Principal Hale did not answer. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. "The formal review has been moved up," she said. "Tomorrow afternoon." Annie's breath caught. "Tomorrow?" "Yes. You may bring a written statement. The board will make a final recommendation after that." After she left, Grace stared at the door. "They're rushing it." Mr. Brooks picked up the screenshots and slid them into a folder. "Yes." "Why?" Annie already knew. "Because they think we're getting too close." The day became a blur of classes Annie could not focus on, and eyes she could feel on her back. At lunch, she stayed with Grace in an empty music practice room because the cafeteria felt impossible. Grace tried to make her eat crackers from a vending machine. Annie took one and held it until it broke in her fingers. "You don't have to go to last period," Grace said. "If I skip, they'll say I'm hiding. They're going to say something either way." Annie looked at the broken cracker in her palm. "I hate that." After school, she went to the library to wait for Aunt Clara, who had insisted on coming to the review tomorrow. Annie tried to draft her statement, but every sentence sounded too weak or too angry. "I did not cheat. That was true, but it felt small against what they had built. I have worked hard. Also true, but hard work had not protected her. I deserve to be believed." She stared at that one for a long time. A shadow fell across the table. Blake stood there, hands in his jacket pockets. No friends this time. "You really should stop," he said. Annie closed her notebook. "Leave me alone. I'm serious. My dad's already annoyed. You keep pushing, it's going to get worse." "It already got worse." Blake leaned down slightly. "You think those screenshots matter? Everybody knows people talk trash. You have no idea what you're up against." Annie's heart pounded. "I know enough." "No, you don't." His voice dropped. "My father can make one call and turn this from a school issue into a legal one. Defamation, harassment, whatever his lawyers want to call it. You and your aunt got money for that?" The mention of Aunt Clara made Annie's stomach twist. Blake saw it and pressed harder. "Go home. Take the punishment. Maybe some community college will still take you after a year or two." Annie looked down at her notebook because if she looked at him too long, she might cry again. "Why do you hate me so much?" she asked. Blake's face tightened. "I don't hate you." "Then why?" For the first time, he had no quick answer. Then he said, almost bitterly, "Because every time you win, my father looks at me like I'm nothing." Annie looked up slowly. That was the first honest thing Blake Whitmore had ever said to her. But honesty did not make him kind. "So you decided I should be nothing instead?" she asked. His expression closed again. "I warned you." He walked away before she could answer. Annie sat alone for a minute, shaking. Then she opened her notebook and wrote down every word he had said. When Aunt Clara arrived, still in scrubs and smelling faintly of antiseptic and peppermint gum, Annie handed her the notebook. Aunt Clara read the new entry, her face going hard. "He threatened you." Annie nodded. "Then tomorrow, they're not just reviewing your record," Aunt Clara said. "They're going to look me in the eye while they try to bury you." Annie whispered, "What if they still do?" Aunt Clara closed the notebook and held it against her chest. "Then they'll have to bury the truth with witnesses standing around the grave." That night, Annie rewrote her statement at the kitchen table. She did not try to sound perfect. She did not try to sound impressive. She wrote like a girl who had nothing left to offer but the truth. At the top of the page, she wrote one sentence and underlined it. "I did not cheat, and I will not confess to a lie just because powerful people are tired of hearing the truth." The next afternoon, Annie arrived at Whitmore Prep with Aunt Clara on one side and Mr. Brooks on the other. Grace was waiting near the front office, holding a folder against her chest. She had tied her hair back and looked more serious than Annie had ever seen her. When she spotted them, she stepped forward quickly. "I printed everything again," Grace said. "Screenshots, timeline, visitor log, camera report." Aunt Clara gave her a tired but grateful look. "Thank you, honey." Grace nodded, then looked at Annie. "How are you?" Annie wanted to say fine because that was the easy answer. The answer people accepted without asking for more. But nothing about her felt fine. Her hands were cold, her stomach hurt. She had slept in short, shallow pieces and woken before dawn with the same thought pressing against her chest. Today they could end it. "I'm here," she said. Mr. Brooks gave a small nod. "That counts." The boardroom was at the end of the administrative hall, past framed photos of graduating classes and donors shaking hands. Charles Whitmore appeared in 3 of them. Charles with a shovel at the science hall groundbreaking. Charles cutting a ribbon. Charles standing beside Principal Hale under a banner that read, "Building Futures Together." Annie slowed when she saw that one. Aunt Clara noticed and touched her arm. "Don't look at the wall. Look at the door." Inside the boardroom, Principal Hale sat at the center of the long table. Mrs. Larkin sat to her right, stiff-backed, a manila folder in front of her. Evan Cole was there too, near the far end, his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. He did not look at Annie. Charles sat beside Blake, not as a formal board member, Principal Hale explained, but as a trustee observer due to the scholarship's connection with the Whitmore Foundation. The explanation sounded rehearsed and wrong. Aunt Clara stopped at the doorway. "Observer?" Principal Hale cleared her throat. "Mr. Whitmore has no vote in this matter. Then why is he sitting closer to the table than my niece?" Charles looked at Aunt Clara for the first time. Not long, just enough to measure her and decide she was inconvenient. "This is a school proceeding," he said. "Not a courtroom." Aunt Clara stepped into the room, then stopped acting like the verdict came before the hearing. Annie looked at her aunt, startled. Aunt Clara's voice was polite, but there was steel under it. The kind of steel that came from long shifts, unpaid bills, and years of saying yes ma'am to people who mistook manners for surrender. Principal Hale gestured to the chairs. "Let's begin." Annie sat with Aunt Clara on her left, Grace on her right, and Mr. Brooks behind them. She placed her written statement on the table, smoothing the page with both hands. The underlined sentence stared up at her. "I did not cheat, and I will not confess to a lie just because powerful people are tired of hearing the truth." Principal Hale began with formal language. Date of incident. Testing protocol. Discovery of unauthorized device. Temporary cancellation of score. She spoke slowly, but every word felt like another brick being placed on Annie's chest. Then Mrs. Larkin read her statement. She said Annie appeared nervous during the exam. She said the device was found in Annie's bag. She said no one had accessed students' belongings during testing. Annie lifted her head. "That's not true," Principal Hale said. "You'll have a chance to respond." Mrs. Larkin continued without looking at her. "Based on the facts available, I believe the integrity of the exam was compromised." When she finished, Charles leaned back slightly. Blake stared at the table, bored. Principal Hale turned to Annie. "You may read your statement." Annie picked up the page, but the words blurred. Her mouth went dry. For a second, she could not breathe. Aunt Clara placed one hand over her wrist. "Slow, baby." Annie nodded. She began, "My name is Annie Carter. I did not cheat on the final exam. I did not bring a device into the testing room. I did not place that pen in my bag. And I had never seen it before Mrs. Larkin pulled it out. Her voice shook, but it held. "I have studied for this award all year. I know what this exam means. I know what losing it means. If I had cheated, I would be admitting that everything I ever worked for was fake. It wasn't. My work is mine." Blake shifted in his chair. Annie kept reading. "Mrs. Larkin's report says no non-testing personnel entered the room after students arrived. That is not true. Evan Cole came to the door during the exam." Mrs. Larkin stepped out. The visitor log shows he was in the testing wing from 8:34 to 8:42. The hallway camera failed at 8:36. Principal Hale looked down at her own folder. Annie's voice grew softer. "I don't know everything that happened. I can't prove every part yet. But I know what didn't happen. I didn't cheat." She set the paper down. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Charles sighed. A moving statement, but emotion does not answer the device in her bag. Aunt Clara turned toward him. "And money doesn't answer why the camera failed." Charles's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Clara Carter, Mrs. Carter, I understand this is painful, but your niece was found with prohibited material. My niece was found with something someone put there. You have no proof of that." Grace opened her folder. "We have proof the report is wrong." Principal Hale held out a hand. "Miss Miller, please. Grace pushed forward anyway. Blake sent messages before Annie was even accused. He said the school needed the right winner. He said his dad handled the scholarship girl. Blake's head snapped up. Those were private. Grace looked at him. So you did write them? His face flushed. That's not what I meant. Mr. Brooks spoke from behind Annie. What did you mean? Blake looked at his father. Charles answered for him. Teenagers say foolish things. If careless words were evidence, half this school would be under review. Annie looked at Blake. You told me yesterday your father fixes problems and I was a problem. Blake laughed, but it came out strained. You're twisting everything. You threatened me in the library. I told you to stop making it worse. For who? Grace asked. Principal Hale raised her voice. Enough. This is not productive. Aunt Clara leaned forward. No, ma'am. It's uncomfortable. That's not the same thing. The room went quiet again. Then Evan Cole cleared his throat. Everyone turned. He looked startled by his own sound. I had a maintenance request, he said quickly. Principal Hale frowned. Mr. Cole? That's why I was in the testing wing. There was a camera issue. I came to check it. Mr. Brooks sat straighter. At 8:34? Yes. The camera failed at 8:36. That happens. During an active final exam? Evan's face had begun to shine with sweat. Systems don't care about exam schedules. Mr. Brooks glanced at Annie, then back to Evan. Did you enter the testing room? No. Annie's chest tightened. You came to the door. I spoke to Mrs. Larkin from the hallway. You stood near the table where the bags were. No, I didn't. Annie looked at Mrs. Larkin. You know he did. Mrs. Larkin's face stayed rigid. I do not recall that. Aunt Clara whispered. Convenient. Charles stood. This has become a fishing expedition. The student was caught. The proctor confirmed it. The device exists. Unless someone can explain how it got in her bag without inventing a conspiracy, the board should protect the school's standards. Annie felt the room slipping away from her. Principal Hale looked exhausted. We will take a short recess. No, Annie said. Everyone looked at her. She had not meant to speak so loudly. Her hands were shaking again, but she could not sit there and watch them fold her life into paperwork. No, she repeated quieter. Please don't go behind a closed door and decide this like I'm not a person sitting right here. Principal Hale's face softened, but Charles cut in. Miss Carter, this is not about your feelings. Annie flinched. Aunt Clara started to speak, but Annie touched her hand. She looked at Charles, and the fear in her was so deep it made her voice thin. It is about my life. Blake muttered. Drama. Grace turned on him. Shut up, Blake. Miss Miller, Principal Hale warned. No, Grace said. He gets to sit here after joking about this, after saying his dad handled her, and Annie is the one being treated like a problem? Charles's voice hardened. This young woman is becoming hysterical. Aunt Clara stood so fast her chair scraped back. Do not call her hysterical, because she's begging you not to steal her future. Charles stared at her. Aunt Clara did not sit down. You can dress it up in rules. You can put it in a folder. You can call it integrity. But I know what a setup smells like, Mr. Whitmore. And this room stinks of it. Principal Hale rose too. Mrs. Carter, please. Annie looked from her aunt to Mr. Brooks, then to Evan, whose hands were shaking now as badly as hers. He looked at Charles once, quick and terrified. Mr. Brooks saw it. So did Annie. Charles did not seem to notice, or he pretended not to. Principal Hale announced the recess anyway. 10 minutes. Everyone remained nearby. Chairs moved. Folders closed. Blake stood and pulled out his phone. Charles walked toward the side door that led to the trustee lounge. Evan remained seated for several seconds, pale, staring at the table. As Annie stepped into the hallway, she heard Mr. Brooks behind her. Mr. Cole. Evan froze. Mr. Brooks's voice was quiet. A lie is a debt. The longer you carry it, the more interest it collects. Evan did not turn around. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, Mr. Brooks said. You do. Evan walked away quickly. Grace leaned close to Annie. He's scared. Annie nodded. Of Charles. Aunt Clara put an arm around her shoulders. Then maybe he knows where the truth is buried. Across the hall, the trustee lounge door was not fully closed. Charles's voice came through, low but clear enough. Keep him quiet, he said, and move the final recommendation today. Annie stopped breathing. Mr. Brooks heard it too. His eyes shifted toward the door. Then Blake stepped out of the lounge and saw them standing there. For once, he did not smile. Blake stood in the doorway of the trustee lounge with his phone in one hand and the color draining from his face. For a second, nobody moved. Annie's hand was still on Aunt Clara's sleeve. Grace had gone still beside her. Mr. Brooks looked from Blake to the half-open door, and his expression changed in a way Annie had never seen before. It was not surprise. It was recognition, as if the lie had finally spoken in its own voice. Blake shut the lounge door behind him. "You didn't hear anything," he said. Aunt Clara gave a short, humorless breath. "That right there is something guilty people say." Blake's eyes flicked toward Mr. Brooks. "This is private school business." "No," Mr. Brooks said. "This is witness intimidation and possibly obstruction." Blake tried to laugh. It failed. "You always talk like you're in court, and you always talk like your father can purchase the ending." Annie barely heard them. Charles's words were still moving through her head. "Keep him quiet. Move the final recommendation today." He had said it like he was ordering lunch, like her future was just another file to close before dinner. She turned toward the lounge door. Grace caught her wrist. "Annie, don't." But Annie was already stepping forward. She pushed the door open before anyone could stop her. Charles stood near the window with his phone in his hand. Principal Hale was beside the conference table, pale and rigid. Mrs. Larkin sat near the wall, clutching her folder. No one spoke when Annie entered. That silence told her they had heard her come in. Maybe they had heard her hear them. Charles lowered his phone slowly. "Miss Carter, this room is not for students." Annie's voice came out small. "You said to keep him quiet." Principal Hale closed her eyes. Charles's face did not change. "You are mistaken. I heard you. You heard part of a conversation you did not understand." Mr. Brooks stepped in behind Annie. "Then explain it." Charles looked at him. "This recess was called for the board, not for a classroom debate." Aunt Clara entered next, one hand still holding Annie's notebook. "We heard enough." Principal Hale opened her mouth, then stopped. Her gaze stayed on the table, on her own hands, on anything except Annie. Annie looked at her. "You heard it too." Principal Hale did not answer. That was answer enough. Charles slipped his phone into his pocket. "This has become inappropriate. Margaret, I suggest we resume and conclude the matter." Aunt Clara stared at him. "You don't get to rush a hanging because the rope is showing." Mrs. Larkin stood. "I will not be spoken to like this." "No one was talking to you," Grace said from the doorway. Mrs. Larkin's face flushed. "This is exactly the problem. No respect for order." Mr. Brooks looked at her. "Order without truth is just control." For a moment, the room held all of them in place. Every person standing on a different side of the same lie. Then Principal Hale reached for the back of a chair as if she needed something solid. "We will reconvene," she said. Now, back in the boardroom, the air felt worse than before. Annie sat down, but her legs kept trembling under the table. Blake took his place beside Charles and would not look at her. Evan Cole returned last. He looked sick. Principal Hale folded her hands. Before the recess, concerns were raised regarding procedural inconsistencies. Charles cut in. "Concerns, not evidence." Mr. Brooks did not look at him. "A false proctor report is evidence of something." Mrs. Larkin snapped. "My report was not false." "Then why did you omit Evan Cole's presence in the testing wing?" "I did not consider it relevant." Grace leaned forward. "A tech employee near students' bags while the camera failed is not relevant?" Mrs. Larkin looked to Principal Hale. "Are we allowing students to interrogate staff now?" Aunt Clara answered before Hale could. "If staff helped frame my niece, yes." Charles's hand came down flat on the table. Not loud enough to be a slam, but enough to make Annie flinch. "This is absurd. Every minute we entertain this performance damages the school." The student was found with a device. The exam is compromised. End of matter. Annie stared at his hand. It was the kind of hand that signed contracts, shook with politicians, rested on Blake's shoulder in newspaper photos. It did not look like a hand that could ruin a girl. Maybe that was the danger. Cruelty did not always come with dirty fingernails. Principal Hale's voice was low. "Mr. Whitmore, please." "No, Margaret. You know what must be done." Aunt Clara turned to Principal Hale. "Did he just instruct you?" Charles smiled without warmth. "Mrs. Carter, I have supported this institution for more than a decade. And you think support means ownership? It means responsibility. No, Aunt Clara said. Responsibility would be checking the truth before you crush a child. Charles's jaw tightened. Do not call her a child when she is old enough to cheat. Annie dropped her gaze. The room went quiet in the worst way. Even Blake looked uneasy for half a second. Mr. Brooks's voice came soft. Say that again, Charles. Charles looked at him. Say it again, Mr. Brooks repeated. Let everyone hear how easily you speak about a girl whose future you're holding in your hand. Charles looked away first, but only because Principal Hale stood. We are moving to final recommendation, she said. Annie's head jerked up. Already? Principal Hale did not meet her eyes. Based on the device recovered, the proctor statement, and the compromised integrity of the exam, the board recommends cancellation of the score and a formal notation pending district academic review. Grace whispered. No. Aunt Clara stood. You can't be serious. It is not final until the district review, Principal Hale said. But she sounded like she no longer believed her own words. Annie felt her body go cold. A formal notation means colleges see it. Principal Hale was silent. That means they think I cheated. I'm sorry. Annie looked at her. No, you're not. The words came out quietly. Not rude. Not loud. Just true. Principal Hale's eyes filled, but tears from the person holding the knife did not help the person bleeding. Charles began gathering his papers. The school has made the correct decision. Evan Cole made a sound. It was small, almost nothing, but in that room, it landed hard. Everyone turned toward him. He had both hands on the table now, breathing too fast. His face was damp. He looked at Charles, then at Annie, then at the folder in front of Mrs. Larkin. I need a minute, he said. Charles's face sharpened. You've had several. Evan swallowed. I need to step out. No, Mr. Brooks said. Stay. Charles turned on him. You do not give instructions here. Mr. Brooks ignored him. Evan, look at me. Evan did not. Mr. Brooks's voice softened. Whatever he promised you, whatever he threatened, it won't hold once this breaks. And it will break. Maybe not today. Maybe not in this room. But lies like this break because they require too many frightened people to stay quiet forever. Charles stood. This is harassment. Evan suddenly pushed back his chair. It scraped hard against the floor. I didn't put it in her bag, he blurted. Annie stopped breathing. Mrs. Larkin's eyes widened. Charles went still. Blake sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. Evan looked terrified by what had just come out of him. Mr. Brooks took one careful step forward. What did you say? Evan shook his head. I didn't put it in her bag. I just handed it off. Charles's voice came low. Stop talking. But Evan had crossed the line, and panic had taken him faster than loyalty could pull him back. I was told to disable the hallway camera for maintenance. Just a few minutes. That's all. Mrs. Larkin was supposed to step out. The bag was on the back table. Mrs. Larkin stood so quickly her chair nearly tipped. That is a lie. Evan pointed at her, shaking now. You took it. You said no one would ever question you because you were the proctor. Annie's eyes filled again, but this time the tears came with shock. Aunt Clara whispered, Lord have mercy. Charles moved toward Evan. You are confused. Evan backed away. No, I'm not. I kept it. Charles stopped. Mr. Brooks noticed. Kept what? Evan looked as if he might be sick. The real device. The one they told me to get rid of after the hearing. I didn't. It's in my office drawer. Grace covered her mouth. Principal Hale gripped the table. Evan, he paid me, Evan said. And now his voice broke. Not directly. Through a consulting invoice. I owed money. I was stupid. I thought it was just some rich kid thing. Changing a score. Making an issue disappear. I didn't know it would. He looked at Annie. I'm sorry, he said. Annie could not answer. The apology hit her, but it did not heal anything. It only proved that her pain had been planned. Charles's expression had become unreadable, but his eyes were dangerous. You have no idea what you're saying. Evan laughed once, bitter and scared. I know exactly what I'm saying. You called me last night. You called me during recess. The logs will show it. Blake turned to his father. Dad? Charles did not look at him. Principal Hale sat down slowly, as though her knees had given out. Mrs. Larkin started speaking too fast, denying everything, saying Evan was unstable, saying Annie's supporters had pressured him, saying this was outrageous. But no one was listening to her the way they had before. Aunt Clara moved close to Annie and put a hand on her back. "Breathe," she whispered. Annie tried. Mr. Brooks looked at Principal Hale. "Now we stop the recommendation." Principal Hale nodded, stunned. "Yes. And we secure that drawer before anyone touches it." "Yes. And we notify the district." Charles spoke then, cold and controlled. "I advise everyone in this room to consider the legal consequences of repeating unverified claims." Aunt Clara looked at him. "You still threatening people?" He looked at Annie. For the first time since this began, she saw something behind his contempt. Not remorse. Not yet. Something closer to fear. Annie wiped her face. Her voice was weak, but the whole room heard it. "You knew." Charles said nothing. "You knew I didn't cheat." His silence filled the boardroom, and for Annie, that silence was the first honest answer he had given. Evan's words did not free Annie the way she had imagined truth would. For a few seconds, the room seemed to tilt, and all she could do was sit there with Aunt Clara's hand on her back, breathing through the shock. She had wanted someone to say it. She had prayed for one adult in that building to admit what had been done. But hearing it out loud did not erase the hallway whispers, the canceled score, the fear that had crawled into her chest and made a home there. It only made the cruelty real. Principal Hale picked up the phone on the table with unsteady fingers. "Security needs to secure the Media Lab office," she said to the receptionist. "Now. No one enters until I get there." Charles stepped toward the door. "This is premature." Mr. Brooks moved before anyone else did, placing himself between Charles and the exit. He did not touch him. He did not need to. "Where are you going?" Mr. Brooks asked. Charles's eyes narrowed. "Move." "No." Aunt Clara stood beside Annie. "You heard the man. Sit down." Charles looked at her with cold disbelief. "You do not give orders to me. And yet here we are." Blake looked from his father to Evan, panic replacing his usual arrogance. "Dad, what is he talking about? What device?" Charles did not answer. That frightened Blake more than any denial would have. Principal Hale rose from her chair, her face pale but set now. "Mr. Whitmore, no one leaves until district officials are notified." Charles gave a short laugh. "You are making a mistake." "I already made one," she said quietly. "I'm trying not to make another." For the first time since Annie had known her, Principal Hale sounded like someone who understood the cost of her own fear. Mrs. Larkin began gathering her papers with shaking hands. "I refuse to be part of this circus." Grace stepped in front of her. "You're not taking those." Mrs. Larkin stiffened. "Excuse me? You heard me." Principal Hale turned. "Mrs. Larkin, leave the folder on the table. It contains my notes. It contains evidence." The proctor's face flushed. "You are treating me like a criminal." Aunt Clara looked at Annie, then back at Mrs. Larkin. "Funny how that feels different when it happens to you." Mrs. Larkin froze, and for a moment Annie saw not guilt, exactly, but fear of losing the protection she had been so comfortable using against someone else. Security arrived with the school resource officer, Officer Ben Collins. A heavy-set man in his 50s who knew most students by name and usually spent his days directing traffic, breaking up parking lot arguments, and reminding boys to take off baseball caps indoors. He stepped into the room, looked around, and sensed quickly that this was no normal discipline meeting. "Principal Hale?" he asked. "We need to secure Mr. Cole's office. There may be evidence related to the exam incident." Officer Collins's gaze moved to Annie. His face softened. He had seen her receive awards in this school. He had once helped jumpstart Aunt Clara's car after a winter concert. "Annie," he said carefully, "you all right?" Annie tried to answer, but her throat closed. Aunt Clara said, "No, she is not, but she's standing." Officer Collins nodded once, then looked at Evan. "You're coming with me." Evan stood. His legs seemed unsteady. Charles spoke sharply. "Mr. Cole, I strongly advise you not to say another word without counsel." Evan looked at him, and something tired passed over his face. "You should have thought of that before you asked me to help ruin a kid." Blake flinched at the word kid. Charles did not. They all moved toward the Media Lab together. Not as a group, but as separate pieces of a broken machine. Students in the hall stared as Principal Hale, Officer Collins, Evan, Mr. Brooks, Grace, Aunt Clara, Annie, Charles, Blake, and Mrs. Larkin walked past. Annie felt the old shame rise again, then something else came with it. Not strength, not yet, but a small refusal to lower her head. Near the media lab, Evan stopped outside a narrow office with a frosted window. Officer Collins unlocked it using a master key from Principal Hale. Inside were 2 desks, a stack of outdated monitors, cables in plastic bins, and a locked drawer beneath Evan's workstation. Evan reached into his pocket and took out a small key. His hand shook so badly he dropped it once. Charles watched in silence. Annie watched Charles. Evan opened the drawer. Inside were manuals, receipts, an energy bar wrapper, and a small padded envelope. He pulled it out and handed it to Officer Collins. "This," Evan said. Officer Collins opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a black pen, nearly identical to the one Annie had been accused of carrying. A tiny device was concealed inside the barrel. There was a scratch near the clip, shaped like a small V. Annie's breath caught. Grace whispered, "That's it." Mrs. Larkin said too quickly, "That could be anything." Mr. Brooks answered without looking at her, "Then you won't mind it being examined." Officer Collins placed the pen back into the envelope. "I'll log it and notify district security." Principal Hale looked at Evan. "Why did you keep it?" Evan rubbed both hands over his face. "Because I got scared. Mr. Whitmore's assistant gave me 2 pens. One to plant, one to destroy if there were questions. I handed the first one to Mrs. Larkin. She handled the bag. After the hearing, I was supposed to dispose of the second one and wipe the access log. I wiped the first layer, but the backup was automatic." Charles said, "This is fantasy." Evan's voice rose. "You called me from the trustee lounge. You told me to keep quiet. You are lying to save yourself." "No," Evan said, looking at Annie now. "I lied to save myself. This is what I should have said before." Annie did not know what to do with his apology. She wanted to hate him cleanly, but his fear made that complicated. Still, complicated did not mean forgiven. "You watched them cancel my score," she said. Evan nodded, tears in his eyes. "Yes. You watched them call me a cheater." "Yes. And you said nothing?" His face crumpled. "I'm sorry." Annie looked away. "Sorry doesn't give me those days back." "No," he said. "It doesn't." Officer Collins sealed the envelope. Everyone back to the office. No more hallway discussions. As they returned, word had already spread. Students stood near classroom doors pretending not to stare. Someone whispered, "They found something." Another voice said, "Wait, so Annie didn't cheat?" Annie heard it. So did Blake. His face had turned gray. In Principal Hale's office, the district academic integrity officer was called on speaker. The conversation was stiff and formal, until Principal Hale said the words that made Annie close her eyes. "We have credible evidence that the student may have been framed." May have been. Even now, the language moved slowly. Aunt Clara noticed Annie's reaction and leaned close. "They'll catch up, baby. Truth got a limp in places like this." Mr. Brooks almost smiled. The district officer ordered the school to suspend the disciplinary notation, preserve all records, and postpone any final decision. He also required written statements from everyone present and a forensic review of the device, camera logs, and exam materials. Charles listened without expression. When the call ended, Principal Hale turned to Annie. "Your notation is suspended pending investigation." Annie stared at her. "Not removed?" "Not yet. So I'm still in between guilty and innocent." Principal Hale's eyes filled. "For now, officially, yes." Aunt Clara's jaw tightened. "Then officially, this school still has work to do." Charles picked up his coat. "And I have counsel to contact." Mr. Brooks stepped aside this time, letting him pass. As Charles reached the door, Annie spoke. "Did you hate me that much?" He stopped but did not turn around. Annie's voice shook. "Or did you just not care what happened to me?" For the first time, Blake looked at her like he had no insult ready. Charles still did not turn. "That question assumes I owe you an answer," he said. Then he walked out. Annie stood there with her hands clenched at her sides, trying not to fall apart again. The truth had begun to surface, but Charles Whitmore had not broken. Not yet, and somehow, that made him feel even more dangerous. The next morning, Annie did not want to go back to school. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror with her uniform shirt buttoned wrong and her hair only half pinned. The girl looking back at her had swollen eyes, dry lips, and a face too tired to pretend. For a moment, she imagined staying home, crawling back under the blanket, letting the school argue with itself without her. Then she heard Aunt Clara in the kitchen. "You want grits or toast?" Annie stepped into the hallway. "I'm not hungry." That wasn't one of the choices. Despite everything, Annie almost smiled. Aunt Clara stood at the stove in her robe, not scrubs this time. She had called out of work for the morning, which Annie knew cost money they did not have. On the counter sat a plate with toast, scrambled eggs, and orange slices cut unevenly. Aunt Clara pushed it toward her. "Eat what you can." Annie sat down and picked at the toast. "You should go to work. I'm going to the school after you." Annie looked up. "Again? Again. They're going to get tired of seeing you." "Good. Let them learn my face." The words warmed Annie more than the food did. She looked toward the refrigerator, where her mother's photo hung beside the college brochure. Denise Carter smiled from that faded picture like she still believed the world could be kind if people chose to be. Annie touched the locket at her throat. "Do you think Mom would tell me to keep fighting?" Aunt Clara turned from the stove. "Your mama would tell you to tell the truth. Then she'd stand behind you with that quiet look of hers that made grown men rethink their whole tone." Annie swallowed. "I wish she were here." "I know, baby." The bus ride felt longer than usual. Annie kept her backpack in her lap and her hands folded over it. At every stop, more people climbed on, carrying lunch bags, purses, tired faces, ordinary worries. A man in a work jacket gave her his seat when an older woman boarded. The woman thanked him and sat with a sigh, then looked at Annie. "You all right, honey?" Annie blinked. "Yes, ma'am." The woman studied her for a second, not prying, just seeing. "Some mornings don't ask permission before being hard." Annie nodded because she could not trust her voice. When she stepped off near Whitmore Prep, the school looked the same from the outside. Same brick buildings, same banners, same trimmed lawns, but something inside had shifted. Yesterday, the whisper had been she cheated. Today, it was maybe she didn't. That was not the same as being cleared. Grace met her by the gate. "People know about the pen." "How?" "Someone saw Officer Collins take it out of the media lab. Then someone saw Evan crying near the office. By second period yesterday, half the senior class had a theory." Annie sighed. "Great. Some of them are on your side now. That's supposed to make me feel better?" Grace's face softened. "No, I guess not." They walked in together. The first hallway felt quieter than Annie liked. Students watched her differently. Now, not with certainty, but with curiosity. That somehow felt worse. She was not a person again yet. She was a scandal changing shape. Near the lockers, a girl from chemistry approached, holding a binder against her chest. "Annie," she said, "I just wanted to say, if it turns out you didn't do it, that's really messed up." Grace stared at her. "If?" The girl flushed. I didn't mean." Annie touched Grace's sleeve before she could continue. "It's okay." But it was not okay. Annie understood the girl was trying. But trying late still hurt. It reminded Annie how quickly people had believed the worst, and how carefully they now wanted credit for believing a little less. In advanced civics, Mr. Brooks had not started the lesson when Annie entered. He stood by his desk, reading from a printed email. His face told her something had happened. After the bell, he closed the classroom door. "Before we begin," he said, "there is a matter I need to address. Some of you have spoken about Miss Carter in ways that were cruel, careless, and in several cases, false." The room went still. Annie looked down at her desk. Mr. Brooks continued, "A person's name is not a toy. You do not toss it around because a rumor gives you something to talk about before lunch." No one moved. Blake's seat was empty. That absence pressed against the room. A boy in the back muttered, "We didn't know." Mr. Brooks turned his eyes to him. Not knowing is exactly when decent people speak less. The boy looked down. Annie's throat tightened. She did not want everyone looking at her, but she was grateful someone had finally said what she could not. After class, Mr. Brooks asked Annie and Grace to stay. He waited until the room cleared, then handed Annie a copy of an email. "The district has scheduled interviews," he said. "You, Grace, me, Evan Cole, Mrs. Larkin, Principal Hale, Blake, and Charles Whitmore. Annie's stomach clenched at Charles's name. When? Tomorrow morning. Grace leaned against a desk. Will Charles actually show up? He may send counsel, but the district requested his presence. Annie read the email. The words looked official and cold, but buried inside them was something she had not had before. Investigation. Does this mean they believe me? She asked. Mr. Brooks was quiet for a moment. It means they can no longer ignore you. It was not the answer she wanted, but it was honest. At lunch, Annie sat with Grace in the library again. This time she ate half her sandwich. That felt like progress until her phone buzzed. It was Aunt Clara. Call me when you can. Not emergency. Annie stepped into the hallway and called. Aunt Clara answered on the first ring. You sitting down? Annie's chest tightened. What happened? I got a call from Mrs. Landry downstairs. 2 men were asking about us. What men? Said they were from a law office connected to Whitmore Holdings. Wanted to confirm where we live and whether I'm your legal guardian. Annie pressed her back to the wall. Why? They didn't say much. Just smiled like people smile when they want you to know they don't have to explain. Fear moved through Annie so fast she felt dizzy. Aunt Clara, I'm fine. I told them any further questions could go through the school district investigator. You said that? I watched TV. Annie almost laughed, then covered her mouth as tears rose. I'm sorry. No, don't do that. You didn't send them. But this is because of me. This is because a rich man got scared. Across the hall, Blake turned the corner. Annie froze. He saw her, hesitated, then kept walking toward her with his hands in his pockets. He looked different without his friends. Less polished. More cornered. I have to go, Annie whispered. Aunt Clara's voice sharpened. Who's there? Blake. Do not be alone with him. Grace had already stepped out of the library, sensing something. Mr. Brooks's classroom was down the hall, door open. I'm not alone, Annie said, and ended the call. Blake stopped a few feet away. My dad didn't send anyone to your apartment. Annie stared at him. How would you know what I was talking about? His mouth tightened. Grace crossed her arms. Wow. Great start. Blake looked tired. I heard him on the phone last night. That's all. Annie's voice was quiet. With lawyers? With somebody. Why are you telling me? Blake looked down the hall, then back at her. Because this is getting out of hand. Grace laughed once. It got out of hand when your father framed her. Blake flinched at framed. You don't know everything. Annie looked at him. Then tell me. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Grace stepped closer. Blake, if you know something, say it. He ran a hand through his hair, angry at himself more than them. I knew he was going to make sure I won. I didn't ask how. I didn't want to know. Annie felt sick. That's supposed to help? No. I'm saying I didn't know about the device until after. But you laughed. He looked away. You watched them call me a cheater and you laughed. His face reddened. I was mad. At me? At everything. Annie's eyes filled, but her voice stayed low. Your anger cost me my name. Blake had no answer. Footsteps sounded from the administrative hall. Charles Whitmore appeared at the far end, walking beside a man in a dark suit Annie had never seen before. His lawyer. She guessed. Charles stopped when he saw Blake standing with her. His face hardened. Blake, he called. Blake turned, and whatever honesty had been on his face vanished under fear. Charles walked toward them slowly. What are you doing? Blake swallowed. Nothing. Charles looked at Annie, then Grace. Miss Carter, I would advise you not to speak with my son without counsel present. Annie's hands went cold again. Grace said. He came to her. Charles ignored her. His eyes stayed on Annie. This situation is difficult enough. Do not add witness tampering to your list of problems. Annie almost stepped back. Then she remembered Aunt Clara's voice. Let them learn my face. Mr. Brooks came out of his classroom before Annie could answer. Charles. The billionaire looked at him with contempt. Daniel. Threatening a student in a hallway now? I'm protecting my son. Mr. Brooks walked closer. Funny. Annie's been waiting for someone in this building to protect a student. Charles's lawyer touched his arm lightly. Mr. Whitmore. Charles held Annie's gaze a moment longer, then turned to Blake. Come. Blake followed, but just before he reached the corner, he looked back at Annie. Not sorry. Not yet. But scared. And fear, Annie was beginning to understand, could make people dangerous. It could also make them talk. By the time the district investigator arrived the next morning, Whitmore Prep had stopped pretending this was a normal school matter. A black sedan pulled up beside the main office at 8:10. A woman stepped out carrying a leather folder and a laptop bag. She was in her late 50s, with close-cropped gray hair, dark glasses, and the steady walk of someone who had spent years entering rooms where people hoped she would not ask too much. Principal Hale met her at the door with a stiff smile. Grace whispered, "That must be her." Annie stood near Mr. Brooks's classroom with Aunt Clara beside her. Aunt Clara had taken another half-day from work and wore a navy cardigan over her scrubs, as if she had decided to look both respectful and ready for a fight. Mr. Brooks checked his watch. Marcia Ellison, District Academic Integrity Office. She's thorough. Aunt Clara looked at him. You know her? Served on a review panel with her years ago. She does not enjoy being lied to. Good, Aunt Clara said. Then she picked the right day to come. Annie watched Miss Ellison shake Principal Hale's hand. There was no warmth in the gesture. Only procedure. Behind them, Charles Whitmore entered through the front doors. With his lawyer and Blake. Charles did not look toward Annie at first, but Blake did. His face was pale. He looked as though he had slept badly, if at all, Aunt Clara noticed. That boy knows more than he said. Annie's stomach tightened. I don't know if he'll say it. Children raised to fear their fathers learn silence early, Mr. Brooks said, but fear cracks when consequences start choosing seats. The interviews were held in the conference room beside the library, one at a time. Annie sat in the hallway with Grace while Aunt Clara spoke first. The waiting was almost worse than the questions. Every door opening made Annie's body tense. Every set of footsteps felt like news. Grace nudged her with a wrapped granola bar. Eat. I can't. You can chew with anxiety. I do it all the time. Annie took it because saying no felt harder. She managed 2 bites. Mrs. Larkin came out of the interview room after 20 minutes, her mouth tight, eyes red with anger. She walked past Annie without looking at her. Evan Cole went in next. He looked like a man walking into a storm he had helped build. He stayed inside nearly an hour. When he came out, he paused in front of Annie. Aunt Clara shifted beside her, alert. Evan's voice was low. I gave her the invoice records and the call logs. Annie held the granola bar in both hands. Okay. I told her what I did. She nodded. She did not know what he wanted from her. Forgiveness. Maybe. Relief. Permission to stop feeling like the villain. She could not give him any of that. Evan seemed to understand. I'm not asking you to say anything. I just wanted you to know I didn't take it back. That's the least you could do, Aunt Clara said. Evan accepted it with a small nod and walked away. Grace exhaled. Wow. Aunt Clara sat back down. Truth doesn't make a man noble just because he finally stops lying. When Annie's turn came, her legs felt unsteady. Aunt Clara started to rise, but Miss Ellison appeared at the door and said, Miss Carter may bring one adult support person. Annie looked at Aunt Clara, then at Mr. Brooks. Her aunt touched her cheek. Take Mr. Brooks, she said. He knows the school language. I'll be right outside knowing the Lord's. Inside, Miss Ellison sat across from Annie with a recorder on the table. Her voice was professional but not cold. Miss Carter, I know you've told this story several times. I'm going to ask you to tell it once more, as clearly as you can. Start with when you entered the testing room. Annie breathed in. She told it. The bag on the back table. Mrs. Larkin by the door. Blake's comment before the exam. Evan coming to the doorway. Mrs. Larkin stepping out. The pen appearing in her bag. The board refusing to check the camera. Charles telling her to accept the result. The trustee lounge. Keep him quiet. Miss Ellison took notes without interrupting except to ask for times. When Annie finished, Miss Ellison leaned back. Why do you believe Mr. Whitmore targeted you? Annie looked down at her hands. Because Blake was going to lose. That is motive for Blake. Why Charles? Annie's throat tightened. She had thought about this all night. How to say it without sounding bitter. How to explain something that had lived in glances, comments, and rooms where she was always expected to be grateful. Because I kept winning, she said. And I wasn't the kind of student he wanted winning an award with his family's name on it. Miss Ellison's pen paused. What do you mean by that? Annie looked up. I mean I ride the bus. I'm on scholarship. I'm black. I don't come with donors or parents who play golf with board members. When I won, people called it inspiring. When Blake lost, they called it embarrassing. Mr. Brooks stayed silent beside her, but she felt his attention like a hand at her back. Miss Ellison nodded once. Thank you for saying that plainly. The words almost broke Annie. She had grown used to adults making her soften hard truths so nobody uncomfortable had to feel accused. After the interview, she stepped into the hallway and found Aunt Clara waiting. She did not ask what happened. She simply opened her arms, and Annie walked into them. Then Charles went in. He stayed inside 35 minutes. Through the closed door, nothing could be heard. But Blake sat 2 chairs away, with his knee bouncing so fast. Grace kept looking at it. His lawyer had gone in with Charles, leaving Blake alone under the eyes of people he could not impress. Annie watched him. Did you know about the call logs? Blake looked over. What? Evan gave them to Miss Ellison. His knee stopped. Grace leaned forward. You really didn't know? Blake swallowed. My dad said Evan would keep quiet. Aunt Clara's eyes sharpened. So you knew Evan mattered? Blake rubbed his face. I knew after, not before. Annie's voice was tired. You keep saying that like it makes it clean. It doesn't, he snapped, then lowered his voice. I know it doesn't. The interview room door opened. Charles came out first, expression controlled. His lawyer spoke quietly into his ear. Charles looked at Blake. Don't say more than necessary, he said. Miss Ellison appeared behind him. Mr. Whitmore, I'll be interviewing Blake without you in the room. Charles turned. He is a minor. He is also a student witness. Counsel may be present if retained for him separately. You may not. Charles's lawyer murmured something. Charles looked displeased, but he could not refuse without making it worse. Blake stood slowly. As he passed Annie, he whispered, I didn't know it would go this far. Annie did not whisper back. It went this far because you let it. He went in. That interview lasted longer than anyone expected. During the wait, Principal Hale walked down the hall holding a folder. She stopped near Annie. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. Aunt Clara straightened. You owe her more than that. Principal Hale nodded. Yes, I do. Annie looked at the woman who had sat across from her and let the word cheater settle into her file. She wanted to feel something clean. Anger. Satisfaction. But all she felt was tired. Why didn't you help me sooner? Annie asked. Principal Hale's face folded with shame. I was afraid. Of him? Yes. Annie looked toward the closed interview room. So was I. Principal Hale blinked, and Annie saw the truth land. The door opened. Blake came out alone. His face was pale, but something in it had changed. Charles stood immediately. What did you say? He demanded. Blake looked at his father, then at Annie. Enough. Charles stepped toward him. Blake. No, Blake said, and his voice cracked. I told her enough. The hallway froze. Charles's face went hard in a way Annie had seen before, but this time Blake did not shrink as quickly. Miss Ellison came to the doorway. I'm placing the disciplinary action against Annie Carter on immediate administrative hold. Her scholarship recommendation is to be reinstated temporarily while the investigation proceeds. The exam materials will be reviewed by an outside panel. Annie did not move. Grace grabbed her hand. Annie, Miss Ellison continued, this does not close the case. But as of now, the evidence no longer supports treating Miss Carter as the offending party. Aunt Clara covered her mouth and turned away, shoulders shaking. Mr. Brooks looked at the floor for a moment, as if saying a private prayer. Annie heard the words, but her heart did not trust them yet. Temporarily. Investigation proceeds. Does not close the case. Still, something had shifted. The school could no longer point at her alone. Charles turned to Miss Ellison. You are making a serious error. No, she said, looking straight at him. I believe that was made before I arrived. For the first time, Charles Whitmore had no immediate answer, but as Annie watched his face close, she knew he was not finished. Men like Charles did not surrender because truth knocked once. They reached for something heavier. By the end of that day, the word temporarily followed Annie everywhere. Her scholarship recommendation was temporarily reinstated. Her disciplinary notation was temporarily held. Her exam score was temporarily under review. People who had looked away from her on Monday were temporarily polite by Wednesday afternoon, as if kindness could be borrowed until the truth became official. Annie hated that word. Temporary meant the floor could still open. Temporary meant Charles Whitmore still had time. Temporary meant she was allowed to breathe, but not too deeply. After school, Mr. Brooks asked Annie, Grace, and Aunt Clara to meet him in his classroom before they went home. The room was quiet except for the hum of the old air vent. Most students had left. A few athletes shouted somewhere outside near the field, their voices rising and fading through the window. Mr. Brooks placed a folder on his desk. Miss Ellison requested the original exam packets from the secure storage room. Principal Hale says they'll be transferred to the district tomorrow morning. Grace leaned against a desk. That's good, right? It should be. Annie heard the warning in his voice. But until those papers leave this building, I don't like it. Aunt Clara crossed her arms. You think somebody might touch them? I think someone already touched them once. Grace looked toward the hallway. Can we make copies? Not legally. Not unless the district authorizes it. Aunt Clara gave him a look. That sounded like a teacher answer. It is, and I'm trying very hard to keep us from giving them a reason to call Annie the problem again. Annie sat at one of the front desks, fingers wrapped around the strap of her backpack. What happens if the exam packet disappears? Mr. Brooks did not answer fast enough. Grace pushed off the desk. No. That can't be their next move. It can be, Aunt Clara said. When people are cornered, they don't suddenly become fair. Mr. Brooks nodded. That's why I asked Officer Collins to confirm the storage room is sealed. He said he would do rounds tonight. Annie looked up. Can we trust him? I believe so, but belief is not a lock. That sentence stayed with Annie as Grace drove her and Aunt Clara home. Outside the car window, Atlanta moved into evening traffic. Office lights came on. Brake lights lined the road like red beads. People were going home to dinner, television, laundry, homework, small arguments about dishes. Annie wondered what it felt like to have a normal bad day again. Grace glanced at her. You okay? Aunt Clara answered before Annie could. No. Annie looked at her aunt. Aunt Clara shrugged. You're not. No need to dress it up. Grace nodded. Fair. Annie leaned her head against the window. I keep thinking if they give me my score back, I'll feel better. You will, Aunt Clara said, but not all the way. No, not all the way. Grace slowed at a light. What would make it all the way? Annie thought about Charles's face. Blake's smile. Principal Hale avoiding her eyes. Mrs. Larkin saying the facts were clear. The group chat messages, the way her name had become something people chewed on between classes. I don't know, she said. Maybe nothing. Aunt Clara reached from the back seat and squeezed her shoulder. Some wounds don't close because somebody fixes the paperwork. But paperwork still matters. You get your name clean first. Healing can take its number, and wait. At home, Annie tried to eat dinner. Aunt Clara made baked chicken, green beans, and rice because she said people under stress needed real food, not vending machine crackers and fear. Annie ate enough to keep her aunt from fussing. Afterward, she sat on the couch with her notebook, but the words would not come. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She stared at it until it stopped. Then it buzzed again with a message. You think this ends well for you? Annie's fingers went numb. Another message appeared. Drop it before your aunt gets dragged into this too. She stood so fast the notebook slid to the floor. Aunt Clara looked up from folding towels. What? Annie handed her the phone. The change in Aunt Clara's face was slow and frightening. Not panic, not surprise, something harder. Grace? Aunt Clara asked. No, unknown number. Aunt Clara took a screenshot, then another. Send this to Mr. Brooks, now. Annie did. Her hands shook. Less than a minute later, Mr. Brooks called. Annie, are you safe? Yes. Doors locked? Aunt Clara answered loudly enough for the phone to catch it. They are now. I'm sending this to Miss Ellison and Officer Collins. Do not respond to the number. Annie sat back down, knees weak. Do you think it's Blake? I don't know. Aunt Clara's jaw tightened. I have a guess. Mr. Brooks said, guessing is for kitchens. Evidence is for consequences. We'll trace what we can. After the call, Aunt Clara checked the locks twice. Annie hated that. She hated watching her aunt move through their home as if Charles Whitmore's reach had entered the apartment and touched the deadbolt. the curtains, the little table by the door where mail collected. "I'm sorry," Annie said. Aunt Clara turned around. "Don't start. But those men came here, now this." "Annie, they're threatening you because of me." Aunt Clara crossed the room and took both Annie's hands. "No, they're threatening us because they did wrong and got scared. That shame belongs to them. Do not carry luggage with somebody else's name on the tag." Annie tried to smile, but tears came instead. Aunt Clara pulled her close. "Cry if you need to, then sleep. Tomorrow we stand up again." Annie did not sleep much. At 2:13 a.m., Officer Collins caught someone entering the administrative wing through a side door. By 6:40 the morning, Mr. Brooks called Aunt Clara and told them to come straight to the school office, not to class. He did not explain much. His voice was too controlled, which Annie had learned meant bad news was standing nearby. When they arrived, the school looked half awake. The front office lights were on. Miss Ellison was already there, wearing the same dark glasses pushed up on her head. Officer Collins stood beside the reception desk. Principal Hale sat in a chair near the wall, pale and shaken. Mrs. Larkin was not there. Charles was. So was Blake. Charles stood near the window, lawyer beside him, expression hard. Blake sat with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. Annie stepped in slowly. "What happened?" Officer Collins looked to Miss Ellison. She turned to Annie. "Someone entered the secure storage room last night." Aunt Clara muttered, "Jesus." "Was anything taken?" Mr. Brooks asked. Miss Ellison's mouth tightened. The exam packet box had been opened. Annie felt the room tilt again. Grace arrived a minute later, breathless. "I came as soon as I saw your text. What's going on?" Annie could barely speak. "The exams." Grace's face went white. "No." Officer Collins held up a hand. "The original packets were disturbed, but not removed. I interrupted the person before they could leave the building." Aunt Clara looked around the room. "Where are they?" Principal Hale's voice was thin. "In another office." "Who?" Annie asked. No one answered immediately. That silence told her before the name did. Miss Ellison said, "Mrs. Larkin." Grace whispered, "The proctor." Annie sat down before her legs failed. "She tried to steal the papers? Alter or remove?" Miss Ellison said. "We don't know yet." Charles spoke for the first time. "I want to be very clear. Mrs. Larkin's actions, if proven, are her own." Mr. Brooks turned on him. "You're distancing yourself already?" "I am stating a fact." Blake looked up, anger and fear mixing in his face. "Dad." Charles did not look at him. "Not now." But Blake stood. "No, now. You said this was handled. You said nobody would get hurt." Charles's eyes cut to his son. "Be quiet." The old Blake would have obeyed. This Blake shook his head. "No. You keep saying that. To me. To Evan. To everyone. Be quiet. Keep quiet. Don't say more than necessary." His voice cracked. "I'm tired of being quiet for something you did." Charles's lawyer stepped forward. "Blake, I advise you. I don't care what you advise." Blake looked at Miss Ellison. "My father knew Annie didn't cheat. He knew before the first hearing." Annie stopped breathing. Charles's face went still. Aunt Clara whispered, "There it is." Blake's hands shook at his sides. "He told me the night before the exam that Annie wouldn't be a problem after finals." I asked what that meant. He said, "Your path will be clear." After she got caught, I knew. I didn't know all the details, but I knew enough, and I let it happen. His eyes moved to Annie. I let them do it. Annie looked at him, and all the anger she expected did not come the way she thought it would. What rose first was grief. Blake had been weak, cruel, jealous. He had watched her bleed and called it victory. But in that moment, he also looked like a boy who had finally seen the cost of wanting his father's approval. That did not absolve him. It only made the wreckage wider. Charles spoke softly. "You have no idea what you're doing." Blake laughed once, broken. "That's the first true thing you've said." Miss Ellison turned to Officer Collins. "I want recorded statements from Mrs. Larkin and Blake Whitmore immediately. Secure the exam packets and transfer them now." Officer Collins nodded. Principal Hale stood, barely steady. "I'll authorize it." Aunt Clara looked at her. "You should have done that days ago." Principal Hale lowered her eyes. "Yes." Annie sat still, hands folded in her lap, while the adults moved around her. Calls were made, folders collected, names written down. The machinery of justice, slow and embarrassed, finally began to turn. Then Charles looked at Annie. For one brief second, the contempt was gone. Beneath it was something rawer, more dangerous, like a man watching a wall crack in a house he thought he owned. Annie did not look away. She had spent days begging to be believed. Now the truth was speaking without asking permission. The exam packets left Whitmore Prep in a district vehicle before noon. Annie watched from the front office window as Officer Collins carried the sealed box to the car, with Miss Ellison walking beside him. It should have felt like a victory. The evidence was no longer sitting inside a building where too many people had touched the truth with dirty hands. Mrs. Larkin had been removed from campus. Evan had given his statement. Blake had finally said what he knew. Still, Annie felt hollow. Grace stood next to her, arms crossed. They can't bury it now. Annie kept her eyes on the car until it pulled out of the lot. They already buried enough. Behind them, Aunt Clara was speaking quietly with Mr. Brooks. Principal Hale sat near her office door, looking like someone who had aged a year in a morning. Charles Whitmore remained at the far end of the lobby with his lawyer, making phone calls in a voice too low to hear. Blake stood apart from him, near the trophy case, staring at the floor. No one knew what to do next. The school day had continued, but not really. Teachers taught with distracted faces. Students whispered in clusters. Parents called the office. The rumor had grown legs, teeth, and names. Annie turned away from the window. "Can I go home?" Aunt Clara was beside her in a second. "Yes." Mr. Brooks looked at Principal Hale. She should be excused for the rest of the day. Principal Hale nodded. Of course. That of course sounded bitter in Annie's ears. Of course, now. Of course, after the evidence. Of course, after the adults who had doubted her had been forced to doubt themselves. As they started toward the exit, Blake stepped forward. "Annie." Aunt Clara stopped first. "Choose wisely, son." Blake swallowed. His face had lost the polished arrogance he usually wore like a jacket. "I just wanted to say..." Annie waited. He looked at her, then at Mr. Brooks, then back. "I'm sorry." The words landed, but they did not settle. Annie's expression did not change. "For what?" Blake blinked. "For all of it. That's easy to say." "I know." "No, Blake, I don't think you do." Her voice was tired, not sharp. "Were you sorry when people called me a cheater? Were you sorry when my scholarship got suspended? Were you sorry when you told me I should stay in my lane?" His eyes dropped. Annie nodded as if his silence answered for him. "You're sorry because the room changed." Grace stood still beside her, watching Blake without pity. Blake rubbed his palms against his pants. "I was jealous." "I know. My dad, he stopped, then shook his head. I hated how he looked at me when you won." Annie's throat tightened. Not with sympathy exactly, but with the pain of seeing how wide Charles's damage had spread. "So you let him look at me like I was nothing instead." Blake had no defense. "I can't fix it," he said. "No," Annie replied. "You can tell the truth every time they ask. That's what you can do." He nodded. "I will." Aunt Clara guided Annie toward the doors before Blake could say more. Outside, the air was warm, and the sunlight felt wrong against the day they had just lived. Grace offered to drive them, but Aunt Clara said she had brought the car. It was an old Toyota with a dented rear door and a church parking sticker peeling from the windshield. Annie slid into the passenger seat and leaned her head back. Aunt Clara started the engine but did not pull away. "You want to say something?" Annie asked. "I want to say about 100 things. Most of them would get me removed from school property." Despite herself, Annie let out a weak laugh. Aunt Clara looked at her. There she is. The laugh faded. "I don't feel here. I know. Everybody keeps saying things are moving now. The evidence, the statements, the review. But I still feel like I'm standing in that hallway with him telling me to accept it." Aunt Clara looked through the windshield. "Because your body hasn't caught up to the truth yet." "What does that mean?" "It means fear don't pack up just because somebody opens a window." Annie turned her face toward her aunt. "Did Mom ever talk about someone named Charles?" Aunt Clara's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The silence came too fast. Annie sat up. "Aunt Clara?" Her aunt did not look at her. "Why you asking that?" "Because Blake's father looks at me sometimes like..." Annie stopped. She did not know how to explain it. Contempt, yes, but lately there had been something else under it, something disturbed by more than guilt. "I don't know. And Mom's locket," she touched the silver chain at her throat. "She never told me who was inside." Aunt Clara pulled into traffic slowly. Your mother kept some things private. Was he one of them? The car moved through the school exit, past the brick sign with Whitmore's name carved into it. Aunt Clara waited until they were on the main road before answering. Your mama loved someone before you were born. Annie's fingers closed around the locket. Charles Whitmore? Aunt Clara's eyes stayed on the road. I never heard her say his last name much. Just Charles. She met him one summer in Savannah. He was younger then. Not yet what he became. Annie felt the words enter her slowly. Why didn't you tell me? Because Denise asked me not to. Why? She said the past was a room she didn't want you growing up inside. Annie stared out the window, but she no longer saw traffic. Was he my father? Aunt Clara pulled into a grocery store parking lot and stopped the car. She turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. I don't know for certain, she said. Annie's chest tightened. That's not no. No, Aunt Clara said quietly. It's not. Annie looked down at the locket. The metal suddenly felt heavier. You knew this whole time? I suspected. Denise never confirmed it. She said your father was a man who chose his world over her. She said that was all I needed to know. And all I needed to know? Aunt Clara's eyes filled. Baby, I wanted to tell you more, but your mama was sick, and then she was gone, and every time I thought about opening that wound, I looked at you studying at that table, trying to build your future. And I thought maybe she was right. Maybe some truths don't help until they have to. Annie's voice trembled. I had a right to know. Yes, Aunt Clara said. You did. That answer hurt more than an excuse would have. Annie opened the locket with shaking fingers. She had never forced it before. Denise had told her it was delicate. And Annie had respected that because it was one of the last things her mother touched. The clasp resisted, then gave. Inside was a faded photograph, folded tight behind the small frame. Annie eased it out carefully. A young Denise smiled beside a young white man outside a diner. His arm was around her. He looked nothing like the cold man in the charcoal suit and exactly like him. On the back, in tiny worn script, were the words, Charles and Denise Summer, 2006, forever, if the world lets us. Annie stopped breathing. Aunt Clara covered her mouth. The parking lot moved around them. A woman loaded groceries into a trunk. A man pushed a cart past their bumper. Somewhere, a child complained about wanting gum. Inside the car, Annie's world narrowed to a photograph. It's him, she whispered. Aunt Clara closed her eyes. Lord, Annie stared at the young Charles, at his smile, at the way Denise leaned into him like she had trusted the future. Then she thought of the older Charles looking at her in the hallway, telling her to accept the result, telling her not everyone got the future they imagined. A sick coldness spread through her. He did this to his own daughter, Annie said. We don't know for sure. Annie turned to her. Look at the picture. Aunt Clara's tears fell now. I know. Annie folded over the photograph, holding it like it might burn through her fingers. Mom knew? She knew who she loved. I don't know what she knew after. Did she try to tell him? Aunt Clara wiped her cheek. There were letters. I saw some. She mailed them. Later she said they must not have reached him. After a while, she stopped trying. Annie looked up. Letters? At the old storage unit. I kept a box of your mama's things. Papers, photos, some clothes. I couldn't throw them away. We need to go there. Now? Yes. Aunt Clara looked at her, and maybe she heard the change in Annie's voice. Not strength, not peace, something sharper than grief. All right, she said. Now. The storage facility sat behind a gas station off a road Annie had passed 100 times without noticing. Aunt Clara unlocked the unit with a key from her glove compartment. Inside were plastic bins, a broken lamp, Christmas decorations, and 2 cardboard boxes labeled Denise. Annie knelt in front of them. Her hands shook as she opened the first box. It smelled faintly of paper, dust, and the lavender soap her mother used to keep in drawers. There were church programs, hospital bracelets, old notebooks, a scarf Annie remembered from childhood, and a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. Aunt Clara sat beside her on the concrete floor. Annie untied the ribbon. The first envelope was addressed to Charles Whitmore. Not Charles. Charles Whitmore. Annie's heart pounded so hard it hurt. The envelope had been returned. unopened. She picked up another, returned, another, returned. On the fourth, written in Denise's hand, were the words, "Please, Charles, this is about our child." Annie pressed the letter to her chest and began to cry. Aunt Clara put an arm around her. "I'm sorry, baby." Annie looked at the returned letters, the locket, the photograph, the proof of a life her mother had tried to explain to a man who never answered. Then she thought of Charles standing in Whitmore Prep, destroying her future without knowing, or maybe without caring, whose child she was. Her tears kept falling, but her voice came steady. "We have to show him." Aunt Clara nodded slowly. "Yes." Annie looked at the envelope again. "No," she said, "not just him." Aunt Clara understood. The truth about the exam could clear Annie's name, but the truth in that box could break Charles Whitmore in a place money could not reach. Annie did not go back to school that afternoon. Aunt Clara drove straight home from the storage unit with the box of Denise's letters on the back seat, and Annie sitting beside her in silence, the locket open in her lap. Neither of them turned on the radio. The city moved around them with its ordinary noise, but inside the car the air felt heavy, as if one more word might make everything collapse. At the apartment, Aunt Clara cleared the kitchen table. Bills, church flyers, grocery coupons, the salt shaker, all of it went to the counter. Then she placed Denise's letters in the center like they were evidence in a trial no court had agreed to hear. Annie sat down slowly. There were 11 envelopes. 8 had been returned unopened. 2 had no stamp. Maybe never mailed. 1 was torn at the top, as if Denise had opened it again years later and read her own pain back to herself. Aunt Clara touched the ribbon. "You don't have to read them all today." "Yes, I do. Bubby, I need to know what he ignored." Aunt Clara did not argue. She sat beside her and waited. Annie opened the torn envelope first. Denise's handwriting was careful, slanted slightly to the right, the way Annie remembered from birthday cards and notes taped to lunch bags. "Charles, I don't want money from you. I don't want your family's approval. I don't even know if I want you back after the way you left. But I need you to know there is a child coming, and that child deserves to be seen." Annie stopped. The words blurred. Aunt Clara reached for her hand, but Annie shook her head, not because she did not want comfort, but because if she accepted it too soon, she might not be able to keep reading. She opened another. "I went by the office your mother told me to visit. They said you were unavailable. I left my number. No one called. I don't know if you are refusing to hear me or if someone is standing between us, but I am tired, Charles. I am tired of being treated like a mistake you can file away." Annie let out a breath that hurt. Aunt Clara's voice was low. "His family." "Maybe," Annie said. "Or maybe him." That was the part she could not soften. Maybe Charles had never known. Maybe letters had been blocked. Calls stopped. Denise dismissed by people guarding his future. But Annie had seen Charles Whitmore up close now. She had seen how easily he chose not to look when looking would cost him. By evening, Mr. Brooks and Grace were at the apartment. Grace brought takeout because she said nobody should read life-changing letters on an empty stomach. Aunt Clara accepted the paper bag, but no one ate much. Mr. Brooks read the letters at the kitchen table with his glasses low on his nose. He did not rush. He treated every page like it belonged to someone living. When he finished, he removed his glasses and set them down. "Does this prove he's your father?" Grace asked softly. Mr. Brooks looked at Annie. "It proves your mother believed he was." Annie nodded. "And the locket proves they were together." "It does." Aunt Clara leaned back in her chair. "There may be hospital records somewhere. Denise gave birth at Grady. I don't know if she listed a father." "She didn't," Annie said. "My birth certificate says unknown." The word had always embarrassed her when school forms required it. Unknown. As if half of her had been misplaced. Grace looked at the letters. "Do we show Miss Ellison?" Mr. Brooks was quiet for a moment. "The letters don't directly prove the exam setup, but they explain why Charles's actions matter beyond the disciplinary case. Still, we should be careful. Once this becomes about possible paternity, Charles may try to make it look like Annie is using the exam scandal to get money." Annie looked up fast. "I don't want his money." "I know that," Mr. Brooks said. "But men like him survive by changing the question. If the question is, did he frame a student? He's in trouble. If he can make the question, is this girl trying to claim his fortune? He'll try. Aunt Clara's face hardened. Then we don't let him. Grace picked up one of the returned envelopes. What if we make him face it in front of someone who can't be bought? Mr. Brooks turned to her. Miss Ellison, she already has the exam case, Grace said. If Charles tries to twist things, she'll see it. Annie stared at the locket on the table. I don't want this to become the reason people believe me. No one spoke. That was the truth sitting beneath everything. If the world only cared because Charles might be her father, then what did that say about the girl he hurt before he knew? Annie did not want her innocence to depend on blood. She wanted it to matter because she was innocent. Mr. Brooks said, then we keep the order clear. First, the exam, the device, the false report, the witness statements. Then, only when the truth of what he did is established, you decide whether to show him Denise's letters. Aunt Clara nodded. Your mother's story shouldn't be thrown into a room full of lawyers like bait. Annie touched the edge of the photograph. But he needs to know. He does, Aunt Clara said. And he will. The next morning, Miss Ellison called Annie in for a follow-up interview at the district office instead of the school. That alone felt different. The building was plain, beige, busy, and not named after anyone. No donor portraits. No plaques praising rich men for giving back what they could spare. Aunt Clara drove. Mr. Brooks met them outside. Grace had class but texted every few minutes. Until Aunt Clara replied, Child, breathe and study. Inside, Miss Ellison sat across from Annie in a small conference room. A recorder was on the table again, along with a sealed evidence report. I want you to know where the review stands, Miss Ellison said. The device recovered from Mr. Cole's office matches the model described in the incident report. Preliminary inspection suggests the pen found in your bag was from the same source. We also have phone records showing contact between Mr. Cole and a number connected to Whitmore Holdings before and after the exam. Annie gripped the edge of the chair. So you know. We know enough to expand the investigation. The outside panel is reviewing your original exam materials now. Mr. Cole has provided a sworn statement. Mrs. Larkin has retained counsel and declined further interview. Aunt Clara gave a quiet scoff. Of course she has. Miss Ellison looked at Annie. Blake Whitmore also gave a statement confirming his father told him your path would no longer interfere with his after the final exam. Annie closed her eyes. It was one thing to feel the truth, another to hear it form a record. Miss Ellison's voice softened. Miss Carter, I cannot undo what happened in those hallways. But I can tell you this. The district is preparing to recommend full reinstatement of your exam eligibility and scholarship materials. Aunt Clara covered her mouth. Mr. Brooks bowed his head. Annie sat very still. She had imagined this moment. She thought she would cry, maybe smile, maybe feel a weight lift. Instead, she felt the weight move, not vanish. It shifted from fear of never being believed to grief that belief had taken this much. Thank you, she said, because she did not know what else to say. Miss Ellison watched her. There's more. Annie opened her eyes. The school board will hold a special session tomorrow evening. Given the involvement of a trustee, this will not remain internal. Mr. Whitmore has been asked to attend. Aunt Clara looked at Annie. Tomorrow, Annie thought of the box of letters, the returned envelopes, Denise's handwriting, the photograph of young Charles smiling like a man who once knew how to be human before power taught him otherwise. Miss Ellison leaned forward. There is something else you want to tell me. It was not a question. Annie looked at Aunt Clara, then Mr. Brooks. Both waited. Neither pushed. She reached into her bag and took out the locket. My mother knew Charles Whitmore, Annie said. Miss Ellison's face did not change, but her pen stopped moving. Annie opened the locket and placed the photograph on the table. This is Denise Carter, she said. My mother. And this is Charles. Miss Ellison looked down at the picture. The room seemed to grow smaller around it. Aunt Clara placed the returned letters beside the locket. Denise tried to reach him before Annie was born. The letters came back unopened. Miss Ellison read the top envelope, then looked at Annie. Are you saying you believe Charles Whitmore may be your father? Annie's throat tightened. I'm saying he may have destroyed the future of the daughter he never knew he had, she said. But I need you to understand something. I was innocent before we found these letters. Miss Ellison held her gaze. Yes, she said. You were. Those two words almost broke her. Annie looked down at her mother's handwriting. Then tomorrow, I want the truth told in the right order. Mr. Brooks nodded slowly. Exam first. Aunt Clara added. Then Denise. Miss Ellison closed the folder with care. Then we make sure no one gets to hide either one. The special session was held in the district boardroom, not at Whitmore Prep. Annie was grateful for that. She did not want another room with Charles's name on the wall. She did not want another hallway where people had already watched her cry. The district building was plain, with beige chairs, a flag in the corner, fluorescent lights, and a long table where board members sat with folders open in front of them. It was not warm. It was not comforting, but it felt harder to buy. Aunt Clara sat on Annie's left. Mr. Brooks sat on her right. Grace was behind them, close enough that Annie could hear her breathing. Across the aisle, Blake sat alone, his shoulders bent, hands clasped between his knees. Charles Whitmore sat at the front with his lawyer, wearing a dark suit and a face that gave nothing away. Miss Ellison entered last. The room quieted. She did not make a speech. She opened her folder and began with the facts. After review of the testing materials, device evidence, access logs, phone records, and witness statements, this office has found no evidence that Annie Carter engaged in academic misconduct. Annie's fingers tightened around Aunt Clara's hand. Miss Ellison continued. The exams submitted under Miss Carter's name showed inconsistencies with her prior work and with recovered draft materials. The original exam packet was disturbed after the investigation began. A device matching the alleged cheating instrument was recovered from a technology office. Staff testimony now indicates that the device was placed in Miss Carter's belongings without her knowledge. A murmur moved through the room. Charles's lawyer leaned toward him, whispering. Charles stared straight ahead. Miss Ellison looked at the board. We recommend immediate full reinstatement of Miss Carter's exam eligibility, removal of all disciplinary notation, restoration of her scholarship recommendation, and formal notice to all universities that the misconduct allegation was unsupported and withdrawn. Aunt Clara let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in her body for days. Annie closed her eyes. Removed. Not suspended. Not pending. Not temporary. Removed. For a second, all she could see was the letter in her hand outside the boardroom, the words misconduct and canceled, Charles telling her to accept it. Then another image came over it. Her mother's photo on the refrigerator, smiling beside that college brochure like she had been waiting for this sentence too. One of the board members, an older black woman with silver braids and a red blazer, leaned toward the microphone. Miss Carter, would you like to speak before the board votes? Annie had not planned to. Mr. Brooks had told her she did not owe anyone a performance of pain. Aunt Clara had said the same thing in different words. You don't have to bleed on command. But Annie stood. Her knees shook, but she stood. Aunt Clara whispered, Take your time. Annie walked to the small podium. The microphone was too high, and the board clerk adjusted it for her. She looked at the board first, then at Miss Ellison, then at the people behind her. She did not look at Charles yet. My name is Annie Carter, she said. I did not cheat. The room stayed silent. I know you have evidence now. I know there are reports and logs and statements, but before any of that, there was me. There was my word, and almost nobody wanted it to be enough. Aunt Clara wiped her eyes. Annie kept going. I lost days thinking my future was gone. I watched people who knew my work look at me like they weren't sure anymore. I begged adults to check the truth, and some of them acted like checking was too much trouble. Principal Hale sat 2 rows back. She lowered her head. I'm grateful the record is being corrected, Annie said. But I need you to understand something. A corrected record does not erase what it felt like to be treated as guilty, because it was easier than believing a girl without power. The woman in the red blazer nodded slowly. Annie finally looked at Charles. He did not move, but his jaw tightened. I was innocent before anyone knew who my mother was, Annie said. I was innocent before anyone found a device in an office. I was innocent when I stood in that hallway crying and asking why I was being treated like I wasn't human. Charles's face changed then, only slightly, but Annie saw it. She took the locket from her pocket and held it in her palm. There is another truth, she said. It does not replace the first one. It does not make what happened wrong, only because of who I might be, to someone powerful. What happened was wrong, because I am a person. Miss Ellison watched carefully. Annie opened the locket. My mother's name was Denise Carter. At the sound of that name, Charles turned his head. It was not a slow turn. It was sharp, instinctive. The kind of movement a person makes when a voice from the past walks into the room. Annie held up the faded photograph. She knew Charles Whitmore before I was born. Blake looked at his father. Charles's lawyer whispered, "Charles." But Charles did not seem to hear him. Aunt Clara stood and brought the returned letters to the podium. Annie placed them beside the locket. "These letters were sent before I was born," Annie said. "Most were returned unopened. One says, 'This is about our child.'" The boardroom changed. It was no longer murmuring. It was listening. Charles stood slowly. His face had lost color. "That's not possible," he said. His lawyer touched his sleeve. "Sit down." Charles ignored him. "Where did you get those?" Annie looked at him. "From the box my mother left behind. Denise never told me." Aunt Clara's voice came from behind Annie. She tried. Charles stared at the letters like they were alive. "She called," Aunt Clara said. "She wrote. Someone sent those letters back. Maybe your family. Maybe your office. Maybe the whole world you chose over her. But don't stand there and act like Denise disappeared quietly." Charles's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Annie picked up one envelope and read the line she had memorized. "Charles, I don't want anything from you. I just need you to know our child deserves to be seen." The words landed harder than any accusation. Blake stood halfway, then sat back down, stunned. "Dad?" Charles looked from the letter to Annie. For the first time, he did not look at her like a problem. He looked at her like a consequence. Annie's voice broke, but she did not stop. "You looked at me in that hallway and told me to accept the result. You told me not everyone gets the future they imagine. My mother begged you to see your child. And years later, you tried to take that child's future away." Charles gripped the back of his chair. "I didn't know," he said. The words came out rough, smaller than him. Annie nodded, tears rising. "You didn't have to know I was your daughter to treat me like a person." No one in the room moved. Even Miss Ellison, who had carried herself with calm through every ugly fact, lowered her eyes for a moment. Charles looked as if the sentence had struck something deeper than reputation. The first crack was not public shame. It was recognition. He took one step toward Annie. Aunt Clara moved instantly, placing herself half in front of her niece. Charles stopped. His voice failed. He tried again. "I need to know if it's true." Annie held the locket against her chest. "So do I." His eyes filled, but Annie did not let that soften the room too quickly. "But today is not about what you need," she said. "Today is about what you did." Charles lowered his head. The board voted minutes later. Unanimous. Annie's record would be cleared. Her score would be restored pending final outside confirmation, with no misconduct attached. Whitmore Prep would issue a formal written apology and notify every college that had received the earlier warning. Mrs. Larkin and Evan Cole would face further investigation. Principal Hale would be placed on administrative leave. Charles Whitmore would be suspended from all trustee and donor advisory roles pending legal review. When the vote passed, Grace began crying behind her. Mr. Brooks placed a hand over his mouth. Aunt Clara pulled Annie into her arms and held her hard. Annie cried too, not because everything was fixed, because someone had finally written the truth down where Charles Whitmore could not erase it. As the room began to empty, Charles remained standing by his chair, staring at the letters. Blake walked over to him, pale and shaken. "Is she my sister?" Charles did not answer. Annie heard the question but did not turn around. She was not ready to be anyone's sister. She was not ready to be Charles Whitmore's daughter. She was barely ready to be herself again. At the door, Miss Ellison stopped beside her. "You did well," she said. Annie wiped her face. "I didn't feel strong. Most people don't when they're telling the truth." Aunt Clara held the box of letters against her chest. Outside, the evening air was cool. The sky over Atlanta had gone soft and gray, and traffic moved beyond the parking lot like life had the nerve to continue. Annie stood on the sidewalk, locket closed in her hand. Her name was clear. Her future was not gone, but behind her, in that boardroom, a man who had tried to destroy her was beginning to understand that the life he had stepped on might be tied to his own blood. And tomorrow, the world would want answers. So would Annie. The next morning, Annie woke before the alarm. For a few seconds, she did not remember where the pain belonged. Then it came back in pieces. The boardroom, the vote, the letters, Charles standing with his hand on the chair like the floor had moved under him. Blake asking if she was his sister. Her mother's words read aloud in a room full of strangers. Annie lay still and listened to Aunt Clara moving around the kitchen. There was no school that day. Principal Hale had placed Annie on excused leave while the district completed the final paperwork. Mr. Lasswaner, Brooks had texted early. Outside panel confirms your exam work matches your drafts and prior performance. Full restoration expected by noon. Breathe. Annie had read it 3 times and still did not feel the way she thought she would. She got up, washed her face, and found Aunt Clara making pancakes from a box mix, something she only did when the day needed softness. The kitchen radio played low. The college brochure was still on the refrigerator. Denise's photograph was still beside it. Aunt Clara turned when Annie walked in. You sleep? A little. That's better than none. Annie sat at the table. The box of letters was still there, now tied again with the blue ribbon. The locket rested beside it. Aunt Clara set a plate in front of her. Eat before the world starts calling. Is it all ready? Mr. Brooks called. Grace texted. Miss Ellison emailed. 2 reporters left messages with the district. Not us. Thank God. Annie touched the fork but did not pick it up. I don't want to be on the news. Then you won't be. Can we stop them? We can stop ourselves from feeding them. Let the district talk about the case. Let Charles talk to his lawyers. You don't owe anybody your face. Annie nodded. She cut a small piece of pancake. What if he calls? Aunt Clara did not ask who. He will, she said. What do I say? You don't have to say anything. Annie looked at her aunt. But I want answers. I know. I want to know if he got Mom's letters. I want to know if he knew and ignored her. I want to know if he looked at me all those times at school and never felt anything. Aunt Clara poured coffee into her blessed and tired mug. Wanting answers is fair. Trusting the person who hurt you to give them clean is another matter. Annie ate because her aunt was watching. The pancakes tasted sweet, and that felt strange. A sweet thing on a morning after so much bitterness. At 11:47, the district email arrived. Annie Carter's academic record has been fully restored. No disciplinary notation will be entered. The previous misconduct notice is withdrawn. Updated letters will be sent to all affected colleges and scholarship committees. Annie read it aloud once. Aunt Clara covered her mouth, and this time the tears came with a sound close to laughter. It's gone? Annie asked, as if the words might change. It's gone from the record, Aunt Clara said, pulling her into a hug. Not from what happened, but from the record. Yes. Annie held on. For days, she had imagined that sentence as a door swinging open. Instead, it felt like someone had stopped pushing her underwater. She could breathe, but she was still wet, still cold, still aware of how close she had come to drowning. That afternoon, Mr. Brooks came by with Grace. Grace carried cupcakes from a grocery store, bakery, and a stack of printed emails, because paper makes things real. Mr. Brooks brought a pen in a small box. It was simple, blue, with Annie's name engraved along the side. Annie stared at it. Mr. Brooks smiled gently. I know. A pen may be a strange gift right now. Grace winced. I told him that. Mr. Brooks ignored her. But they used one to tell a lie about you. I thought you should have one that tells the truth. Annie opened the box and read the engraving. Write your own name. Her eyes filled. Thank you, she said. Mr. Brooks nodded. Use it at college. Grace bounced once in her chair. Speaking of college, did you check your portal? Annie froze. No. Grace looked personally offended. Annie, I was scared. Aunt Clara pointed toward the laptop on the counter. Then be scared while logging in. They gathered around the small kitchen table as Annie opened the university portal. Her hands shook as she typed the password. The page loaded slowly, cruelly, then refreshed. Congratulations, Annie Carter. Your admission and full scholarship package have been reinstated. No one spoke at first. Then Grace screamed. Aunt Clara grabbed Annie from one side, Grace from the other, and Mr. Brooks stood behind them with one hand over his eyes. Annie laughed and cried at the same time. The sound ugly and alive, and hers. I got it, she whispered. Aunt Clara held her face. You earned it. Later, after Grace left and Mr. Brooks promised to call about the next steps, a black car stopped outside the apartment building. Aunt Clara saw it first through the blinds. No, she said. Annie came to the window. Charles Whitmore stepped out of the back seat. No lawyer. No Blake. No cameras. He looked smaller, without a room arranged around him. Aunt Clara turned to Annie. You don't have to. I know. He can stand out there till Christmas. Annie almost smiled. I'll talk to him downstairs, not inside. Aunt Clara grabbed her keys. Then I'm standing close enough to become a problem. Charles was waiting near the walkway when they came down. He held an envelope in both hands. His eyes moved to Aunt Clara first. Mrs. Carter, don't dress this up, she said. He accepted that with a nod, then looked at Annie. The look was different now, but Annie did not trust different yet. I'm not here to ask you for forgiveness, he said. That's good, Annie replied. Pain crossed his face. He deserved that pain, and she let him have it. I received preliminary DNA results, he said. I requested an expedited private test using legal counsel. I know that sounds like something rich people can do by lunch, Aunt Clara said. Charles lowered his eyes. Yes. Annie's throat tightened. And? He looked at her. You are my daughter. The world did not stop. A car passed. Someone upstairs shut a window. A dog barked behind the next building. Annie had thought those words might crack the air open, but instead they settled into a silence that had been waiting for them. She nodded once. Charles's hands trembled as he held out the envelope. These are copies of records my lawyer found this morning. My mother's office received Denise's letters. They were returned by staff under family instruction. I didn't see them. Annie looked at the envelope but did not take it. Did you know about me? No. Did you know Mom tried to reach you? He swallowed. No. Do you expect that to make me feel better? No, he said. It makes me feel worse. Annie looked at him then. Really looked. For the first time, she searched his face not for cruelty, but for traces of the young man in the photograph. They were there, buried under years of money and pride, but traces did not make a father. You destroyed me before you knew, she said. His eyes filled. I know. You didn't have to know I was your daughter. I know. Say the rest. Charles closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his voice was rough. You should never have had to be my daughter for me to know what I did was wrong. Aunt Clara stood very still. Annie took the envelope, not because she forgave him, but because it belonged to her mother's story. What happens to Blake? She asked. He'll face the school's consequences. And mine, though I have no right to pretend I taught him better. And you? I'm resigning from the foundation board. The district investigation will continue. My company's involvement will be reviewed. I'll cooperate. That sounds like your lawyer talking. It is partly my lawyer, he admitted, but the shame is mine. Annie looked down at the repaired locket around her neck. I'm going to college. Charles nodded. I heard. Not because of you. No. Not because your money fixed it. No. Because I earned it. His voice broke. Yes, you did. For the first time, Annie saw tears fall from his eyes. She did not move to comfort him. His regret was not her responsibility. Charles wiped his face quickly, embarrassed by his own humanity. May I write to you? Not as a father. I know I haven't earned that. Just to answer what I can. About Denise. About what I failed to know. Annie looked at Aunt Clara. Her aunt's face said the choice was hers. One letter, Annie said. No pressure, no gifts, no interviews, no showing up at my school. Yes, and if I don't answer, you leave me alone. Charles nodded. I will. She believed he meant it in that moment. She did not know if that would be enough later. 2 months later, Annie stood at the Greyhound station with a suitcase, a backpack with a repaired strap, and the blue pen from Mr. Brooks tucked into the front pocket. Aunt Clara had packed chicken sandwiches, apple slices, and cookies in a brown paper bag because she said airport food was robbery and bus station food was worse. Grace cried first, which surprised no one. Mr. Brooks hugged Annie carefully and told her, write everything down. Not for them. For you. Aunt Clara held on the longest. You call when you get there, she said. I will. And when you get scared? I'll call. And when you get too proud to call? Annie smiled through tears. You'll call me. That's right. At the edge of the parking lot, Charles stood beside his car. He had not come closer. He had asked first, through Mr. Brooks, whether he could be there. Annie had said he could stand at a distance. Before boarding, she walked over to him. He looked surprised. "I read your letter," she said. He nodded, waiting. "I'm not ready to call you anything. I understand. I don't know if I'll ever be. I understand that too." She studied him for a moment. "But I'm glad I know the truth." His face tightened with emotion. "So am I." The boarding call came. Annie stepped back. "Goodbye, Charles. Not Dad. Not Mr. Whitmore. Charles." He accepted it like a man receiving more than he deserved. "Goodbye, Annie." She turned and walked back to Aunt Clara, Grace, and Mr. Brooks. Then she climbed onto the bus with her bag, her restored record, her mother's locket, and a future no one had the right to steal. As the bus pulled away, Annie looked out the window at the people standing below. Aunt Clara waved with both hands. Grace blew her nose into a napkin. Mr. Brooks lifted one hand. Charles stood farther back, still and quiet. Annie touched the locket. For years, she had thought the world would open if she worked hard enough. Then she learned that hard work could be stolen, truth could be delayed, and powerful people could mistake silence for permission. But she had also learned something else. A name could be cleared. A lie could be dragged into daylight. A girl could cry in a hallway, shake so badly she could barely stand, and still be telling the truth with more strength than the man trying to crush her. Annie Carter was not leaving because she had been saved. She was leaving because she had survived, and because she had earned every mile ahead of her. The lesson of Annie Carter's story is simple but painful. A person should never have to be powerful, wealthy, or connected to be treated with dignity. She deserved fairness before the truth became useful to the powerful. This story reminds us that injustice often begins when good people stay quiet, when institutions protect reputation over truth, and when the weak are expected to accept what the powerful decide. But it also shows that one honest voice, even a trembling one, can expose a lie. Justice may come late, but when people refuse to stay silent, the truth can still find its way into the light. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.